Under a pale September moon in 1932, the white letters of the Hollywoodland sign gleamed faintly against the night. A young woman stood upon Mount Lee, her breath slow, her gaze lost among the city lights scattered below like spilled jewels. The wind stirred her coat as if urging her to speak, but she remained silent. Welcome, my friend, to Timeless History Documents. Before we begin our quiet journey through the mists of another life, tell me, where and when are you listening from? Add your memory to ours, a small ember in this great circle of time. And if these whispered histories bring you peace, do subscribe so that we may wander together again. The night was very still that evening, save for the low hum of the city breathing below the hills. From up there, Los Angeles seemed unreal, a constellation of trembling fires scattered across an invisible plain. The air smelled faintly of dust and eucalyptus, and somewhere far off, a coyote cried. The letters before her, towering and white, seemed both ancient and newborn, as though some forgotten god had carved them to remind men of their hunger for glory. Hollywoodland, they declared, each curve of metal rising from the earth like a monument to longing itself. And before them stood a figure, slender, composed, wrapped in the fragile silence of decision. In that stillness, time appeared to fold upon itself. One could almost imagine the years unwinding, this woman's life running backward through the maze of ambition and disappointment, back to the first moment when light fell upon her small, expectant face. She was not a ghost then, not a headline, not the story whispered across decades. She was only Lillian Millicent Entwistle, a child of Wales, born beneath gray skies and quiet valleys, a place where voices carried softly through mist. No one there could have foreseen that her name would one day echo among the canyons of California, bound forever to a sign that promised dreams but delivered silence. Her father was an actor, too, a man of restless spirit and worn shoes. He carried her across the ocean to America, chasing work and perhaps something more elusive, a sense of belonging in a world that never seemed to stand still. In the harbor, the smell of salt and coal lingered as ships rocked against their ropes, and the little girl watched the gulls wheel overhead, their cries sharp and distant. She did not yet know what exile was, but she felt it already, the ache of leaving, the tremor of beginnings. New York was a hard and humming city, its streets pulsing with the rhythm of new invention. Trams clattered, voices rose in many languages, and somewhere always someone was dreaming of a stage. Peg, she would soon be called Peg, found herself drawn to the theater not for fame, but for the quiet order it gave to emotion. Behind the curtain, the chaos of life could be shaped, measured, and made beautiful. She learned to listen, to the hush before a line, to the weight of silence after applause. Perhaps that is where the seed of her fate was planted, not in despair, but in an overabundance of feeling, a sensitivity too finely tuned to endure the dull noise of the world. The Hollywood Hills in that final night must have looked endless to her, the city shimmering below like a mirage. There's a loneliness particular to high places, the sense that one stands both above and outside of all human motion. Peg had climbed there not as a defeated woman, but as a seeker of meaning, one last time. Many would later speak of her as a symbol of broken dreams, but symbols are cruel simplifications. She was not broken, she was tired. The endless waiting for a role, the quiet humiliation of being almost chosen, the long afternoons when the telephone never rang. These were not tragedies in themselves, yet together they became a slow erosion, like water carving stone. The wind shifted, the sign creaked faintly. She reached out, touching the cold metal of the H. There are those who say she lingered there for a while, watching the city that had once promised her everything. Perhaps she remembered her first nights on Broadway when the audience was close enough that she could feel their breath. Perhaps she recalled her father's laughter or the way his voice filled a room. Or perhaps she thought of nothing at all, only of the quiet she had been chasing all along. It is strange how a place meant for advertisement could become a shrine. The Hollywoodland sign was never intended for reverence. It was a sales gesture, a beacon for real estate investors. Yet when Peg's body was found below it, the sign was transformed, suddenly burdened with meaning. Every bright surface in this world, it seems, must cast its own shadow. The dream of Hollywood shining so loudly for millions required its martyr, and she unknowingly became it. But before this night, before the wind, before the fall, there was the girl, the hopeful one, whose laughter once filled rehearsal rooms. She was not merely a footnote in tragedy. She had once been adored for her voice, praised for her subtlety. She had walked New York streets beneath theater marquees bearing her name. The city had known her scent, a mixture of perfume and rain. And even then, there had been an air of distance around her, as though she lived half inside her roles, half within a dream. The wind grew colder. Below, the city continued to hum its indifferent tune. How many windows were alight that night? How many others were awake, nursing their own small despairs? She had written a note, brief and almost formal. "I am afraid," it said, and then, "I am sorry." The words, like her, were precise, unembellished, and deeply human. Fear and sorrow, the twin companions of all who chase something larger than themselves. Standing there, perhaps she felt the strange calm that comes when one has gone too far to return. It is not resignation, but release. The hills, the sign, the city, all seemed to merge into one vast silence. For a fleeting moment, she must have seen herself from afar, not as a failed actress, but as a figure suspended between two worlds, the living and the remembered. In that instant, she became what she had always sought to be, unforgettable. And so, beneath the indifferent stars, a soft sound broke the night. The hills swallowed it quickly, and soon there was only the murmur of the wind again, brushing gently against the white metal letters. Down below, Los Angeles continued to glitter, as though nothing had changed. The same wind that once brushed her hair on that high hill long ago had many years before crossed the wide Atlantic and tangled itself in the masts of a ship bound for America. Within its restless breath lay the faint cries of gulls and the creak of wooden decks, and among the passengers stood a little girl, holding her father's hand. Her coat was too large for her, and the salt in the air stung her cheeks. She did not yet know what America was, nor what it meant to leave one world for another. Yet she could sense the tremor of possibility in her father's silence, the kind of silence that belongs to dreamers. It was the 1910s, and the world was changing shape, growing louder, faster, more impatient. The Entwistles were not alone. Hundreds, thousands crossed the ocean that year, carrying trunks filled with belongings and hearts filled with hope. Some sought work, some escape, some reinvention. Peg's father sought the theater. He had been a man of small fame in the British stage world, remembered for his expressive eyes and his way with melancholy parts. To his daughter, he was a magician, someone who could become another person by shifting his gaze, by lowering his voice. The first time she saw him rehearse, she thought he had truly become someone else. She clapped, not because she understood the play, but because she sensed transformation, that most mysterious of human gifts. Later, when she would study acting herself, she would remember that moment and wonder if art was nothing more than the attempt to find one's truest self through disguise. They settled first in New York, where the skyline rose like a promise. Peg's earliest memories of the city were not of buildings, but of noise. The ceaseless murmur of carriages, vendors, pianos from open windows, the hiss of gas lamps, the strange laughter spilling from theater doors. The world smelled of smoke and roasted nuts, and always of ambition. Her father found work in repertory companies, traveling between towns, sometimes leaving her in the care of friends while he performed. Each time he left, she would watch him disappear into the crowd until he was no longer a man, but a silhouette among thousands. In those moments, she learned both devotion and solitude. The child grew to love the spaces that others overlooked, the narrow corridors behind the stage, the faint scent of grease paint, the dusty corners where old costumes slept. Sometimes, if she was quiet, she could slip into the wings and watch rehearsals unseen. The stage lights fascinated her, how they could change everything they touched, turning ordinary faces into symbols, ordinary movements into meaning. She felt then that the world itself must be a kind of theater, its people moving through invisible acts, repeating their lines without knowing who had written them. When she was still very young, perhaps 10 or 11, she watched a woman performing a scene of heartbreak on stage. The woman's sobs were perfect, but Peg noticed something strange. The woman's hands trembled, not from pain but from control, from the effort to shape sorrow into something beautiful. That night, Peg asked her father if sadness could be taught. He smiled sadly and said, "No, my love, but you can learn how to carry it so it doesn't crush you." Those words she would remember all her life, though she would one day fail to follow them. Then came the year of the accident. A collision in the street, a carriage gone astray, and her father was gone. It was said that he died instantly, though Peg always wondered what he might have thought in that final second. Did he see her face? Did he regret bringing her here, to this new world of hard pavements and indifferent crowds? Death, when it comes early, changes the texture of time. For Peg, the days after his passing stretched endlessly, yet the years that followed seemed to vanish in a blur. She was taken in by relatives, kind though distant, and sent to school, where she was taught refinement and restraint, two virtues that would later become both her armor and her undoing. The theater remained her secret sanctuary. She joined a small amateur group standing in for missing players, her voice trembling, but her eyes fierce. She discovered that when she performed, people listened. They did not interrupt. They did not forget her mid-sentence. The applause, gentle at first, seemed to wash her clean of loneliness. Yet even then she sensed the danger of that feeling, the way approval could fill the emptiness only for a moment, then leave a deeper hollow behind. At night, she often dreamt of her father standing at the edge of a stage, his shadow long and patient. In these dreams, he never spoke. He merely looked at her with a quiet understanding, as though to say that everything she sought was already within her, though she could not yet see it. Perhaps all great longing begins with loss. Peg carried her grief not as a wound, but as a compass. It pointed her toward the lights, the scripts, the applause, and the infinite repetition of pretending to be someone else in order to feel real. New York in the 1920s was an awakening city. The jazz age had begun. The old world was dissolving into rhythm and smoke. Theater houses multiplied, and with them came opportunity. Peg, now a young woman, began training more formally, absorbing the diction, posture, and poise of classical performance. Her instructors noted her seriousness, her striking presence. She was not dazzling like some, but there was something deliberate in her movements, a rare intelligence of feeling. It was said that when she stood on stage, even before speaking, the audience leaned forward. She drew them not by force, but by stillness. But for every step forward came a reminder of fragility. She had no family wealth, no powerful patron, no safety net. The city could love you one night and forget you the next. Peg learned early to hide her fears behind poise, to nod politely when others boasted of connections she would never have. Behind her calm eyes, an unease grew, the kind that only those touched by early loss understand. She was haunted not by ghosts, but by the knowledge that everything she loved could vanish. Sometimes, in the deep of winter, she would walk alone through Central Park after rehearsals, the lamps glowing dim through the fog. She liked the sound of her own footsteps, the crunch of frost beneath her shoes. The city felt ancient then, and she would imagine herself as part of a long procession of dreamers crossing its bridges. She wondered if her father would have been proud, if he would have seen in her the same restlessness that had carried him across the sea. And in that wondering was a kind of peace, a sense that even in his absence, she was continuing his story. The night air grew colder and she pulled her coat tighter, her breath rising like smoke. Above her the moon slipped behind a veil of clouds, and she paused, sensing that familiar loneliness returning, not as pain but as presence. Perhaps that is what solitude truly is, not emptiness, but the quiet company of memory. Somewhere far off a theater bell rang, calling players to the stage. She smiled faintly. The city was full of beginnings. And in the hush that followed, she imagined applause again, soft as the whisper of the sea that once carried her here, across the wide Atlantic. It seemed to echo faintly through the bare trees, mingling with the same wind that, years later, would rise again above the Hollywood hills. The bell that called the players to the stage seemed to follow her home, lingering in her ears long after the sound had faded. It was not merely a summons to performance. It was the call of purpose itself, the invisible thread that would weave through all the years ahead. The city outside her window was restless with light, the elevated trains roaring through the night, their sparks glimmering like fireflies in the cold air. Peg Entwistle, now in her late teens, would lie awake and listen to that metallic lullaby, feeling both exhilarated and terrified by the knowledge that her life was no longer hers alone. Something vast and unseen awaited her beyond those flickering marquees, and she would not rest until she had touched it. In those years, the theater world of New York was a kingdom of contradictions. Beneath the elegance of velvet curtains and champagne openings lay exhaustion, jealousy, and the constant fear of being forgotten. Yet to those who belonged to it, even its cruelty was sacred. Peg entered this world like an acolyte at the door of a temple, humble and hungry, her every gesture polished to precision. She studied under respected mentors, learned how to command a line without shouting, how to let silence speak louder than movement. Her voice, they said, carried the clarity of English rain, pure, cool, slightly melancholic. On stage, she became someone beyond herself, her posture noble, her gaze steady. The audience could not look away. When she walked down Broadway after rehearsals, she sometimes caught her reflection in shop windows. There she saw not the girl who had crossed the ocean, nor the orphan of grief, but a young woman molded by discipline, her beauty luminous yet restrained. She did not seek attention. It found her. The casting directors began to remember her name, though she was still one among many, a small candle in a sea of gaslight. But even a small flame can draw the eye if it burns steadily enough. And so, with quiet persistence, she began to rise. Her early performances were in modest productions, drawing room dramas, comedies of manners, small tragedies that played to polite applause. Yet those who watched her closely knew she was destined for larger things. She had what the critics called the invisible gift, that mysterious ability to make words live beyond the page. She did not merely act, she became. Each gesture, each pause, seemed to carry the weight of thought. Audiences trusted her without knowing why. But art is a jealous companion. The more success she tasted, the more she withdrew from ordinary joys. Parties bored her, flirtations felt trivial. Her fellow actors admired her, but few truly knew her. Some found her cold. Others said she was too serious for her age. Yet behind that composure burned an intensity that frightened even her. She wanted perfection, not the illusion of it, but the impossible kind that existed only in dreams. Perhaps it was the shadow of her father's memory that pushed her forward, or perhaps it was the old wound of loss that could never be fully healed. Whatever its source, it made her tireless. She spent hours after rehearsals repeating lines alone, adjusting a movement until it felt true. Once, a stagehand passing by overheard her whisper, "Again," to herself, again and again, as though she could rehearse her way into existence. When the time came for her first major role, she approached it with a kind of sacred fear. The play was unremarkable, but her presence transformed it. Critics took notice, praising her intelligence, her restraint, the subtle gravity of her expression. She was, they wrote, a spirit of delicate strength, touched by quiet sadness. Peg smiled at those words, but felt unease behind them, as though they hinted at something inside her she had not meant to reveal. The theater became her only home. The faint smell of sawdust and varnish, the rustle of scripts, the thud of shoes on worn floorboards, all these were her lullabies. She loved the moment before the curtain rose, that breathless suspension when the world seemed to pause between realities. In those seconds, she could believe in anything. She often said that the audience's silence was her favorite sound. It was not emptiness, but attention made holy. And yet even then she sensed that such silence could turn cruel. Applause could vanish. Names could fade. The city's memory was short, and tomorrow someone younger might outshine her. There were days when she would walk through Times Square in the early morning after a night performance, when the city still smelled of rain and electricity. The lights were dimmed, the posters damp, the pavement slick. She would stand before the theater where she had performed and look up at her own name, printed modestly among others. It filled her with both pride and sorrow. Pride because she had earned it through devotion. Sorrow because it seemed so fragile, so easily erased. The name Peg Entwistle had begun to mean something in the small world of New York drama, but she feared that fame might vanish as suddenly as it had come. One evening, after a particularly demanding rehearsal, she lingered in the empty theater long after everyone had gone. The only light came from a single lamp left burning near the front row. Dust swirled in its glow, and the air was thick with the echo of lines once spoken. She sat on the edge of the stage and let her hands rest on the cool wood. For a long time, she did not move. It was as though she were listening to the faint heartbeat of the building itself. She thought of her father again, the way he had spoken of the stage as a living creature, breathing through those who dared to stand upon it. She whispered his name then, softly, as though calling across years and oceans. For a moment, she felt he answered in the hush around her. That night, walking home through the dim streets, she carried that sense of communion like a fragile flame cupped in her hands. She believed, perhaps for the first time, that her path was certain. The world had noticed her. The curtain had risen. The applause had found her. And yet, beneath that certainty lingered a whisper, a fear that each triumph might already contain its ending, that every curtain rising must one day fall. The streets grew quieter as she neared her building. Somewhere far off, a jazz tune drifted from an open window, light and careless. She paused, listening, then smiled faintly, as though at a private joke. Life, she thought, was a play whose ending one could never rewrite. She climbed the steps slowly, her shoes echoing in the stairwell, and as she closed the door behind her, the city seemed to fade into silence once more. The next morning when she awoke, the first light of day fell through the thin curtains and lay across her scripts and notes. Dust motes turned in the beam like floating stars. She sat up, brushed the sleep from her eyes, and whispered her lines again under her breath, though no one was there to hear them. Outside, New York roared to life, and the wind that had once crossed oceans stirred faintly through the open window, carrying with it the scent of rain and the faraway sound of bells. The morning light that slipped through the curtains was pale and trembling, the kind that belongs to early spring when the air is still brittle with cold. Peg sat for a long while in that light, her scripts scattered around her, her thoughts wandering between past and future. There was no grandeur in her little rented room, only the scent of paper, the faint hum of the city below, and the whisper of dreams too large for their surroundings. Yet within that quiet space, something had changed. Her name, once spoken only by fellow students and teachers, now passed on the lips of directors, critics, and actors who once barely noticed her. She'd begun to ascend, not in a blaze, but in a steady, measured glow, the kind that endures when sudden fame burns away. New York was alive with transformation then, a city that seemed to hum with invention. The 1920s were in full bloom, smoke curling from cabarets, the chatter of speakeasies, the tapping of typewriters that birthed both gossip and genius. The theater stood at the center of it all, a mirror to human folly and hope. Peg moved among it like a quiet comet, drawing notice, not through noise, but through presence. Her performances in Tommy and the Uninvited Guest caught the eye of the serious critics, who wrote of her as a young woman of rare discipline and inner light. They said she carried on stage a sadness that was not performed but lived, an aura of knowing that could not be taught. And perhaps it was true. Her tragedy was already inside her, folded neatly behind her grace. In the evenings, after rehearsals, she often walked along the dim corridors of the theater, trailing her fingers against the cool walls. There was something sacred about those spaces once the crowds had gone, as though the very air retained echoes of breath and laughter. The stagehands respected her for her seriousness. She never flirted, never drank before curtain time, never indulged in vanity. When others laughed too loudly, she smiled gently and retreated to her dressing room, where she would sit before the mirror and study her reflection with quiet curiosity. Sometimes she whispered her lines again, watching how they changed when she spoke them softly. Her face, she knew, was beautiful, but she distrusted beauty. It was a trick of the world, a currency that devalued itself too quickly. Talent, control, truth. Those were the things that mattered. Her dedication was not without cost. There were nights when exhaustion pressed heavily upon her, when her reflection in the mirror seemed to belong to someone else entirely. Her eyes, once bright with curiosity, began to carry a shadow, the faint mark of someone who had seen too much and felt too deeply. She told no one of her fears, but they lingered in her voice, in the way she paused before delivering a line, as if she could hear the echo of her own heart before speaking. Directors loved that quality. It made her performances haunting, real, unforgettable. Fame, though, is rarely the same as fulfillment. Peg's success on the stage did not bring her peace. If anything, it deepened her solitude. She moved through cast parties like a ghost of her own making, smiling when addressed, drinking sparingly, always leaving early. The laughter of others seemed distant, hollow, like the echo of a world she had once inhabited but no longer believed in. Her fellow actresses envied her poise, her control, her air of mystery. But Peg would have traded all of it for a single night of unguarded laughter, the kind that had filled her father's house before the accident. The older she grew, the clearer it became that applause, no matter how warm, could not replace love. There was one night when the applause went on longer than usual, rising like a tide that would not recede. The curtain had fallen, risen again, fallen once more, and still they clapped. Peg stood center stage, bowing lightly, her smile gracious but distant. In that roar of approval, she felt only stillness. She looked out into the sea of faces, and for a moment she could not distinguish one from another. They were lights, not people, brief, burning, soon to fade. When she left the stage and closed the dressing room door behind her, the silence struck her like a blow. She sat for a long while before the mirror, removing her makeup slowly, stroke by stroke, until only her pale skin remained. Then she whispered, almost to herself, "It is never enough, is it?" Outside, the city was slick with rain. She walked home without her umbrella, the wet streets reflecting the lights of theaters and taxis. Her footsteps echoed faintly, mingling with the patter of rain and the distant sound of jazz. It was a city that belonged to those who dared to hope, yet Peg felt, even then, that hope was a kind of delicate madness. She thought of her father again, of the way he had once spoken of art as the noble lie. He had believed that through performance one could reach something eternal, even if one's own life was fleeting. Perhaps that was true, but she also knew how fragile the illusion could be. The moment the curtain fell, it all dissolved, leaving only the ordinary air. As the weeks passed, her name began appearing in more reviews, sometimes accompanied by photographs. The newspapers praised her refinement, her emotional restraint, her English grace. Agents began to circle. Offers came from other theaters, other cities. She accepted most politely, declined others with careful diplomacy. Outwardly, her life appeared to be unfolding perfectly, a young actress of rising reputation, poised for greatness. Yet inwardly, a faint unease had begun to stir. She could not explain it to herself, but there were moments when the applause seemed to mock her, when the weight of expectation pressed too heavily upon her shoulders. One evening after a rehearsal, she found herself alone on the theater's rooftop, drawn there by a need she could not name. The city spread before her in 1,000 glittering windows, the air sharp and cold. She leaned against the iron railing and closed her eyes. The wind touched her hair, carrying the smell of rain and smoke. For a fleeting instant she felt something that was neither joy nor sorrow, but a strange kinship with the vastness around her. It was as if she belonged to all of it, the lights, the rooftops, the anonymous millions below, and yet to none of it at all. When she opened her eyes, she whispered her own name into the wind, testing how small it sounded against the immensity of the city. The sound vanished instantly. Below her, a taxi horn wailed. A clock struck midnight. Peg lingered a little longer, then turned to go, her footsteps soft against the roof tiles. Somewhere deep inside, she already sensed what she could not yet name, that every ascent carries within it the faint outline of its own fall. The city roof still shimmered in her mind the next morning, the vastness of it, the sense of being one small figure suspended above a sleeping multitude. Yet life below moved swiftly, indifferent to reflection. Letters arrived, scripts awaited reading, meetings were scheduled, and within that whirl of professional demand came something she had not expected, an invitation not to an audition, but to dinner. It was from an actor she had met in passing, Robert Keith, a man slightly older than her, with a voice like velvet rubbed against stone and eyes that carried the ease of someone who believed the world would always forgive him. She hesitated before replying, sensing in his charm a danger she could not name, yet something within her, a quiet longing for companionship, for a mirror to her solitude, urged her to accept. Their first meeting was under the dim glow of a restaurant lamp, its yellow light softening the edges of both faces. The air was thick with cigarette smoke, laughter, and the faint music of a violin. He spoke quickly, eloquently, about the theater, about dreams and failures, about the futility of fame. She listened more than she spoke, captivated less by his words than by the rhythm of his voice. It reminded her of the sea she had crossed as a child, restless, magnetic, and ultimately impossible to hold. When they parted that night, he took her hand, and something unspoken passed between them. Not love, exactly, but recognition. Two actors, two wanderers, both searching for warmth in the cold machinery of ambition. Their courtship was brief. The pace of their world did not allow for slow unfolding. Within months, they were married in a quiet ceremony, the kind that leaves no grand photograph, only the memory of vows whispered too softly to echo. Peg, dressed in simple ivory, looked radiant but fragile, as though she were standing not in celebration but at the threshold of some deeper mystery. Robert kissed her forehead instead of her lips. Even then, there was distance in the gesture, but she dismissed the unease. she told herself that love, like acting, was a matter of faith, that if one believed deeply enough in the illusion, it might become true. At first, their life together carried the sweetness of novelty. They shared the same profession, the same vocabulary of rehearsal and stagecraft. They read lines together by lamplight, their laughter filling the small apartment like the echo of applause. Peg admired his experience, his confidence, the ease with which he navigated the volatile theater world. He seemed to know everyone and be known by everyone. When they walked together through Broadway crowds, she felt seen not as a lonely rising actress, but as half of a complete story. Yet even in those early days, she sensed the cracks beneath the surface. The nights he returned home later than promised, the sudden shadows in his eyes when she asked about his past, the vague evasions when money or previous commitments were mentioned. One evening, while sorting through papers, she found a letter tucked carelessly between pages of a play. It was written in a woman's hand, affectionate, familiar, unmistakably intimate. The date was from months before their wedding. She read it twice, her eyes tracing the words without emotion, as though she were studying a line of dialogue. When Robert came home, she said nothing. Instead, she watched him pour a drink, his movements fluid and unconcerned. It was then she understood what she had known all along, that charm, in his world, was both weapon and disguise. In the days that followed, the illusions of their marriage began to unravel quietly, thread by thread. She learned that he had been married before, that he had a son he had not mentioned, that debts trailed him like shadows. Each revelation came not in confession, but through whispers and fragments overheard. When she confronted him, he smiled with the weary patience of one accustomed to forgiveness. "I thought it wouldn't matter," he said. "It was all long ago." But time, Peg knew, does not dissolve truth. It only buries it until the right silence digs it up again. They quarreled seldom, yet the air between them grew heavy with what was unsaid. Her work continued to flourish, but the joy she once found in it seemed dulled, as though some vital spark had dimmed. She began to perform with a strange intensity, her eyes haunted, her gestures edged with real sorrow. Critics praised the new depth of her acting, unaware that the pain they admired was not artifice. The stage, once her refuge, became the only place where she could still breathe freely. Off stage, the world felt too bright, too exposed. There were brief reconciliations, of course, moments when Robert's tenderness returned, when he spoke of starting anew, of moving to another city, perhaps even trying their luck in Hollywood. He told her she was destined for more than the stage, that her beauty belonged to the screen. She smiled, though inwardly she feared the vastness of that world, its cold machinery of image and rejection. But she wanted to believe him, wanted to believe in anything that could heal the emptiness growing between them. For a time she did. Then one night, after a long rehearsal, she returned home to find the apartment dark and silent. On the table lay a note, brief, almost careless. He'd gone west without her, seeking opportunity, promising to send for her once he was established. She sat down, the paper trembling in her hand, and felt the familiar chill of abandonment creep through her bones. It was not the leaving itself that broke her, but the way it echoed every departure of her life. Her father vanishing into the crowd, the ship fading into fog, the curtain falling after each performance. She realized that love, like applause, could fade before one even noticed it was gone. The days that followed were gray and shapeless. She moved through them with the precision of habit, rehearsing, performing, smiling when required. But inside, she felt hollowed out. When friends invited her to dinners or gatherings, she declined politely, preferring the quiet company of her thoughts. She began walking the city again as she had in her youth, tracing old streets, watching strangers from park benches. New York, once her companion, now seemed vast and indifferent, its lights less welcoming than before. One evening, she found herself outside the theater where she had made her first true debut. The marquee still stood, though the play had changed, the names replaced. She lingered there for a long time, watching the people arrive, their faces full of anticipation. She wondered what they would think if they knew that dreams, like stage lights, could burn too brightly to be endured. The sound of laughter drifted from inside, and for a moment she closed her eyes and let it wash over her. It was almost enough to make her believe that nothing had changed. But as she turned to leave, she caught sight of her reflection in the darkened glass of a nearby shop. The woman who stared back at her was still beautiful, still composed, but her eyes carried the weight of a story not yet finished. She touched the glass lightly, as though to comfort the stranger behind it, and whispered, "We will begin again." Then she walked away, her figure swallowed by the crowd, her footsteps blending with the hum of the city. In time she would follow him west, though not for love alone. Something deeper called her there, a need to test whether the horizon could hold what the city had taken. But for now, the rain began to fall again, fine and steady, and she tilted her face to meet it, the drops mingling with the salt of her own quiet tears. The rain fell in thin, silvery threads that night, a soft veil over New York's restless glow. Peg walked beneath it without haste, her steps measured, her thoughts adrift in the sound of the drops striking pavement. It was a familiar rhythm, the steady percussion of change, of departure. She had known it before, on docks and in station yards, whenever the world required her to leave one chapter unfinished in order to chase the next. But this time, the leaving carried a heavier silence. There was no father waiting at the end of a voyage, no promise of a warmer home. There was only a letter from the West, a few lines from Robert written in a hurried hand. "Hollywood is opening its gates, Peg. The studios want new faces. Come." There was no tenderness in the words, only ambition disguised as opportunity. Still, she folded the letter carefully as if it were a relic and placed it among her scripts. Something inside her, a mixture of pride and weariness, told her that this was not about love anymore. It was about proving to herself that she could cross yet another frontier and survive. The journey west began as all transformations do, quietly, almost unwillingly. She boarded the train with a single trunk, its brass edges worn smooth by travel, and found her seat among strangers who spoke in accents of a different America. Outside the window, the landscape stretched endlessly. First the snow-streaked plains, then the rolling hills, and finally the dry, sunburnt expanse of California. The rhythm of the train lulled her into reverie. Sometimes she imagined she was being carried not forward but backward, retracing her life to some earlier point, before disillusionment had taken root. Other times, she thought of her father and wondered if his spirit watched over her still, guiding her through yet another act in this long, uncertain play. Los Angeles greeted her not with grandeur, but with a haze that seemed to soften everything. The streets, the voices, even her own sense of reality. The air was thick with dust and orange blossoms, and the hills rose in pale gold against the sky. Hollywood in those days was not yet the sleek empire it would become. It was a place of contradictions, where glamour sprouted amid rough terrain and hope shared space with ruin. There were bungalows where future stars waited tables, mansions where past stars lived in seclusion, and always the distant shimmer of something unreachable, the promise of immortality through film. Peg found lodging in a small boarding house in Beechwood Canyon, a quiet place with a view of the hills. From her window she could see, high above, the white letters of the new sign, Hollywoodland. It loomed vast and unfamiliar, yet somehow familiar too, as though it had been waiting for her all along. At night it glowed faintly in the moonlight, and she would stare at it for long minutes, wondering what sort of fate could be written in so few letters. To her, it seemed both invitation and warning, an altar to the twin gods of ambition and despair. Days in Hollywood were deceptively bright. The sky never seemed to end, the streets smelled of heat and gasoline, and everywhere people spoke of luck. She began to attend studio auditions, walking through gates guarded by men in uniforms, her scripts neatly folded, her confidence carefully arranged. Inside, the atmosphere was different from the theater she knew. There was no hush before a performance, no reverence for the craft. Everything was speed and experiment. Faces photographed, voices tested, expressions measured like merchandise. The camera's eye, cold and unblinking, cared nothing for soul or effort. It captured only surface. Her beauty, once a quiet advantage on stage, now became a burden. Casting directors admired her look but found her too refined, too serious, and too theatrical. They asked her to smile more, to be lighter, less thoughtful. She complied as best she could, though it felt like betraying herself. On the stage, emotion had weight and depth. Here, it was an accessory. Each rejection chipped a little more from her certainty. Yet she persisted, unwilling to admit that the rules had changed. Robert, meanwhile, moved easily within this new world. His charm, his adaptability, his willingness to flatter. These served him well in the fickle society of film. For a time, they appeared together at parties, his arm around her waist, her smile composed but distant. The gossip columns began to mention her name alongside his, hinting at a promising career to come. But promises, in Hollywood, were made of air. The calls became fewer, the scripts thinner, and the hours longer. Robert's work took him elsewhere, often for weeks at a time, and the silences between them grew vast. She began to see less of him, until eventually it was as though she were living with his shadow. Sometimes she took long walks through the canyon in the late afternoon, when the light turned amber and the hills glowed like the edge of another world. She would climb a little way up the slope, just far enough to glimpse the sign more closely, its letters enormous, their paint already beginning to fade. Below, the city sprawled endlessly, a sea of promises glittering faintly through the dust. From that vantage point, she could almost believe she had found what she came for, perspective. Yet the stillness of the place also frightened her. There was too much space for thought, too much silence for comfort. The theater world in New York had been crowded with voices and certainties. Here, everything felt weightless. Days melted into one another. The mailman brought more advertisements than letters. Friends drifted away. The few acquaintances she made in the film world seemed perpetually distracted, always scanning the horizon for the next opportunity. Peg began to realize that Hollywood was not a community but a mirage, constantly shifting to reflect one's desires and fears. And perhaps that was its true genius, to convince everyone that their reflection was unique. At night, when the city below flickered with 1,000 small lights, she would sit by her window and read aloud from her old stage scripts. The words comforted her. They belonged to a world where meaning still mattered. Sometimes she imagined she was back on Broadway, hearing the applause that came not from curiosity but from connection. But when she closed the book, the illusion vanished. The only applause now was the hum of insects in the dry grass, the faint whisper of wind across the hills. There was, within her, a growing sense of division. Part of her still belonged to the stage, the discipline, the intimacy, the belief that art could redeem suffering. But another part had begun to drift towards something quieter, more fatalistic. Perhaps the camera's indifference had infected her. She began to see herself as others might see her, a figure of grace slightly out of time, beautiful but misplaced. The duality unsettled her. She no longer knew which self was real, the one who sought light or the one who found comfort in shadow. One afternoon she received a telegram from a small studio offering her a role, minor but visible. It was enough to stir a faint spark of hope. She accepted at once, convincing herself that this was the beginning of her true arrival. Yet when filming began, the experience was disorienting. Scenes were shot out of order, emotions reduced to fragments, her lines rewritten without warning. The director, though kind, treated her as decoration. When the final cut was released months later, much of her part had been removed. Her name appeared briefly in the credits, barely noticed. She sat alone in the theater during its first showing, watching her few remaining moments flicker by like a ghost. Then the lights came up and no one looked at her as they filed out. That night, walking back to her room beneath the fading stars, she passed beneath the sign once more. Its letters loomed above her, indifferent and eternal. She paused for a long moment, her hand resting against the rough bark of a eucalyptus tree, the scent sharp in the cool air. The city below shimmered like water, and somewhere, faintly, she could hear laughter. She wondered if Robert was among them, or if he, too, had become lost in this endless mirage. She whispered his name once, not in anger, not even in longing, but as one might whisper a forgotten line from an unfinished play. The wind carried it upward toward the white letters, and it seemed to vanish there, absorbed by the hollow metal, leaving no echo behind. The eucalyptus tree under which she had paused still trembled in the wind the next morning, as if remembering her presence. Down below, the city stretched wide and glittering, its morning light almost cruel in its brightness. Peg rose early that day, as she often did, unwilling to let despair sleep too long beside her. She dressed neatly, as if preparing for an invisible audience, her white blouse pressed, her hair pinned back with precision. There was something sacred in that ritual of self-presentation, the quiet insistence that she would remain graceful even in defeat. She looked once more toward the sign high above her, the white letters hazy in the sunlight, and whispered softly, "All right then. One more try." That afternoon, she took the streetcar into the city for another audition, one of those endless hopeful rituals that kept Hollywood alive. The building was small, the walls plastered with smiling faces of actors long replaced. In the waiting room, she sat among others who shared her weariness, each clutching a headshot, each rehearsing a line in a trembling whisper. The air smelled faintly of powder and wilted flowers. When her turn came, she entered the small studio with measured calm, greeted the casting director with the poise of the stage, and began her lines. She gave them not the bright desperation they expected, but something quieter, more human. When she finished, there was a long pause. The man behind the desk smiled politely and said, "You're very good, Miss Entwistle. Too good, perhaps. We'll let you know." The phrase was both compliment and dismissal, the standard mercy of a city built on rejection. Outside, the sun struck her eyes, and she blinked against its glare. The street was crowded, yet she felt invisible. She walked without direction for hours, her shadow lengthening behind her as the afternoon faded. She thought of the stage she had left behind, the applause that once followed her every breath, and wondered if she had been foolish to chase the camera's cold affection. Yet something within her resisted regret. She had not come all this way to mourn. Somewhere in this city, she believed, there was still a place for her, a role waiting to be played. When she returned to Beechwood Canyon that evening, the air was fragrant with jasmine and the faint scent of burning wood. The hills glowed gold in the setting sun. As she climbed the narrow path toward her small room, she met a group of young men carrying equipment. They were filming near the sign, they said, an advertisement perhaps. One of them recognized her name and smiled. "You're the actress from 13 Women, aren't you?" he asked. Peg hesitated, unsure whether to accept that claim. "I was," she replied, and the man, oblivious to her tone, wished her luck. She watched them go, their laughter echoing up the hillside, and felt an odd mixture of pride and shame. Even being the actress from something felt like belonging, and belonging, even briefly, was a mercy. She climbed higher, to the ridge below the sign, and sat on a flat stone where she could see the whole city spread beneath her. The letters rose behind her like pale monuments, their edges catching the last of the day's light. From there, Los Angeles looked unreal, a vast mirage of silver and smoke. She watched the sunset dissolve into violet and thought of how many others in that moment must be gazing at the same sky. their hearts heavy with the same unspoken question. How long can a dream live before it turns to dust? The first stars began to appear, faint pinpricks against the lingering glow. Peg drew her knees close and rested her chin upon them. Her thoughts drifted not toward fame, but toward the simple peace of recognition, the desire for someone, anyone, to look at her and see more than an image. Yet even as she sat there, she understood that Hollywood did not reward the soul. It devoured it gently, with flattery and light. To survive, one had to become part illusion. She wondered if she had that strength, if perhaps she was too honest for this glittering deceit. The wind rose from the canyon, carrying the smell of sage and dust. She watched the white letters shimmer faintly in the dark, and for a moment they seemed alive, whispering her name. Perhaps it was only the wind, or perhaps the hills themselves had learned to speak the language of those who dream too hard. The letters spelled Hollywoodland, but to her they read something else entirely, something closer to a question than a name. In the weeks that followed, she tried again and again, attending readings, writing letters, sending photographs, waiting by the phone that never rang. Each day she performed the ritual of hope, waking early, dressing carefully, walking into the city with her chin held high. And each evening she returned to the hills, where the quiet seemed more honest than the polite smiles of producers. She began to know the landscape intimately, the curve of the trails, the scent of eucalyptus after dusk, the way the city lights blinked like tired eyes below. Her acquaintances spoke often of luck. They believed in it with a fervor that bordered on religion. Peg listened to their chatter with gentle skepticism. She did not believe in luck. She believed in effort, in sincerity, in art. But Hollywood was built upon chance, and sincerity was considered old-fashioned. When she spoke earnestly, people smiled as though she were quaint, a remnant from another era. "You should lighten up, darling," one actress told her at a party. "Nobody wants tragedy anymore. They want sparkle." Peg smiled in return, but felt her stomach tighten. She had lived through too much loss to sparkle on command. Sometimes she visited the beach alone, where the ocean met the horizon in a blur of silver. She would stand with her shoes in hand, feeling the cold water wash against her feet. The endless rhythm of the waves reminded her of the applause she once knew. Distant, unending, impersonal. The sea did not care who she was, and there was comfort in that indifference. Once, as she stood there, she thought she saw a ship far out at sea, a dark silhouette against the fading sun. It reminded her of that first voyage long ago, of beginnings that felt like endings. She closed her eyes and whispered a line she had once spoken on stage. "We are all travelers, though none knows where the road will break." Back in the canyon, nights grew colder. She often left her window open so the wind could enter, carrying with it the scent of dry grass and stars. The telephone remained silent. Robert, she knew, had gone elsewhere, perhaps chasing another opportunity, another illusion. She thought of him less with anger than with resignation. He was part of the pattern now, the pattern of reaching and losing, of hope dissolving into silence. And yet, despite all, there were moments when she felt a strange serenity. Walking through the city at dusk, she would catch sight of her reflection in a shop window and see not failure, but a certain grace, the beauty of endurance. She began to understand that every artist in the end must walk a lonely road, that between ambition and despair lies a narrow strip of humanity where truth resides. Perhaps that was enough. Perhaps being forgotten was only another kind of peace. But as the months passed, the hills began to change. The grasses turned brittle. The air grew heavy with the scent of summer. Hollywood was expanding, swallowing the canyons with its noise and its neon. The sign, once bright, now stood neglected, its paint peeling, its scaffolding rusting in the sun. It watched over the city like a weary sentinel, a monument to promises half kept. Peg looked at it often, wondering if she too had begun to fade. She had come seeking rebirth, but instead had found a reflection of her own fragility. beauty distant and untouchable, poised forever between shining and decay. One evening, as she climbed the trail once more, she paused midway and turned to face the city. The lights below shimmered through a thin veil of haze, and she realized how small they looked from this height, how easily dreams could vanish into the landscape. The sign loomed behind her, its silent white curve catching the last embers of twilight. She closed her eyes and listened to the wind moving through the dry grass, its whisper soft and endless. In that sound she heard not despair, but something older, something almost tender, the voice of all those who had once believed, who had once stood where she now stood, gazing down upon the world that had promised them everything. The twilight deepened into violet and then into black, the last warmth of the sun fading behind the far mountains. Peg descended the hillside slowly, the dry earth crunching beneath her shoes, the city below already glittering like a scattered crown. The sound of cars drifted faintly upward, blending with the rustle of the leaves. Each light, each sound seemed to whisper to her that life was still going on, endlessly, heedless of her solitude. Yet she felt strangely calm, almost detached, as though she were watching it all from the wings of a vast and indifferent stage. The air was cooling now, scented with sage and smoke. When she reached her little room, she left the lamp unlit for a while, letting the moonlight spill across the floorboards. The walls, bare and pale, seemed to pulse with a kind of expectant quiet, as if even they were waiting for news that never came. In the days that followed, Peg's routine settled into a kind of graceful repetition. Each morning she rose early, washed in silence, and prepared herself as though for a performance. She still believed that appearance could summon destiny, that if she walked into the world each day looking composed, fate might mistake her for someone worthy of notice. She would take the trolley down to Sunset Boulevard, her gloves clean, her posture upright, her face touched lightly with powder. She carried her scripts like talismans, though the names written on them had long since faded. Auditions became her form of worship. Each waiting room was the same, a row of hopeful faces, the nervous tapping of shoes, the dry taste of anticipation. She learned to read the eyes of the assistants who called the names, some kind, some tired, some already bored before she entered the room. Inside, she gave each performance as though it were her last, her voice steady, her gestures measured. Sometimes the casting men would look up briefly, impressed perhaps by her precision, but more often they would glance at their watches, offer a perfunctory smile, and murmur, "We'll be in touch." The phrase had become the city's refrain, a lullaby for the forgotten. She walked back home through the glare of afternoon, her shoes gathering dust, the city's noise pressing against her like heat. The billboards above the boulevards shimmered with faces, smiling, flawless, interchangeable. She began to recognize a kind of cruelty in those images, the way they erased individuality and replaced it with perfection. She wondered what had happened to the women who failed to smile brightly enough, who had once posed for the same cameras only to vanish into the sun-bleached streets. Somewhere among them, she thought, her own reflection might already be dissolving. Evenings brought small comforts. Sometimes she was invited to a gathering, a little salon of artists and dreamers who spoke in low voices about their work, about the fickleness of studios, about the price of compromise. In those moments, Peg felt almost at home. There was a melancholy camaraderie among them, a shared understanding that they were all drifting in the same uncertain current. Yet even there, beneath the laughter, she sensed the quiet tension of competition. Everyone listened to one another, but no one truly heard. The wine was warm, the air thick with longing. She often left early, walking home beneath the new electric lights, their hum echoing faintly in the night air. Her own small film, 13 Women, was released that summer. She attended the screening alone, sitting near the back of the theater. The air inside smelled of popcorn and dust, the screen flickering in pale silver. When her scene appeared, a brief moment, almost incidental, She watched herself as though watching a stranger. The light caught her face for an instant, and then she was gone, cut away mid-expression. No one in the audience reacted. When the credits rolled, her name appeared for barely a breath before vanishing into darkness. She remained seated long after the house lights came up, her hands folded in her lap. The people around her talked easily, already moving on to other amusements. She rose quietly and slipped out, her shadow long and thin upon the floor. Outside, the evening was sharp with wind. She stood beneath the marquee, watching the title of the film shimmer in the neon. A young couple passed, laughing. She wanted to ask them what they thought, whether they remembered the woman with the brief, trembling smile. But the question seemed absurd, even in her own mind, so she walked away, her steps slow, the city sounds fading behind her. That night, she could not sleep. The flicker of the screen still haunted her eyelids, the image of herself so vivid yet so powerless, reduced to a fragment in someone else's story. It was not humiliation she felt, nor even failure, but erasure. To be forgotten while still alive is a peculiar kind of death. In the weeks that followed, she found herself withdrawing from the city's noise. She spent long hours walking the canyon trails, her hat shading her from the relentless sun. The hills were dry now, their grasses brittle underfoot. Lizards darted between the stones, and hawks circled lazily overhead. She felt closer to them than to the people below. Sometimes she brought a small book of poetry and read aloud to the wind. Her voice, softened by the open air, seemed to dissolve before the words could finish. Yet there was peace in that dissolving, a sense that perhaps her failures mattered less here, where no one was watching. Her neighbors in the boarding house spoke kindly to her, though they sensed her distance. They said she was polite, quiet, a bit mysterious. Occasionally they heard her humming through the thin walls, old stage tunes that had once filled crowded theaters. On Sundays, she wrote letters to friends in New York, describing her days in gentle tones, omitting the loneliness. She signed them always the same way, "With affection, Peg." None of the letters mentioned Robert. His silence had become a part of her world now, as natural as the ticking of the clock. One night, she dreamed of the stage again. The theater was vast and empty, its seats stretching into darkness. She stood at the center, waiting for the curtain to rise, but no music came, no voice called her name. She began to recite a line she could not remember, her voice echoing faintly against the bare walls. Then the stage lights went out, leaving her in complete darkness. She woke with a start, her heart beating fast. The room was silent except for the distant hum of the city below. She rose, went to the window, and looked toward the sign on the hill. Even in the darkness, she could see its pale outline against the sky, the great letters sleeping like giants. For reasons she could not explain, the sight comforted her. It was as though the sign itself, so grand and indifferent, understood her exhaustion. As summer waned, she began to feel time differently. Each day was both endless and fleeting, filled with small tasks that carried no weight. She continued to audition, continued to hope, though with less conviction. Yet in those quiet evenings on the hillside, when the air cooled and the stars began to appear, she felt an odd kinship with the city that had forgotten her. It, too, was a place of contradictions, bright and hollow, alive and dying all at once. Perhaps that was why she could not leave. She belonged to it now, to its fragile illusions, to its unspoken sorrows. The light from her window burned late that night, a small flame in the dark canyon. Inside, Peg sat at her desk, writing another letter, though this one had no address. Her pen moved slowly, the ink smudging in places. She paused, then folded the paper carefully, sealing it with deliberate calm. The city below murmured faintly, as if dreaming. She placed the letter in the drawer beside her scripts and blew out the lamp. The room fell into silence, and only the wind remained, brushing softly against the glass, carrying with it the faintest echo of applause from a time long gone. The drawer that held the letter became, in the months that followed, a small archive of silence. Inside it lay other pages, notes, fragments, thoughts never sent, all written in her careful, slanted hand. Each began with hope and ended with hesitation. There were letters addressed to old friends in New York, to directors who might not remember her, to acquaintances whose kindness she doubted. And there were others, letters to no one in particular, written as if to air itself, where she confided the truths she could not speak aloud. She wrote not to be heard, but to feel the shape of her own thoughts before they vanished. Sometimes, after finishing one, she would fold it and place it among the rest, her movements precise, ritualistic, her eyes dry. She told herself that she would send them someday, though she knew she never would. The small room grew quieter as autumn approached. The hills outside turned brittle and gold, the sunlight harsher, the nights unexpectedly cool. Peg would sit by her window in the evenings, the letters near her elbow, and watch the slow drift of light across the canyon. Below, the city shimmered as it always had, distant, insistent, unreachable. Sometimes she imagined that each flickering window held a story like her own, someone waiting for a call that would not come, someone measuring their worth against the silence of the world. It comforted her to think she was not alone in her solitude. Her daily life became almost monastic in its rhythm. She rose early, took tea with a slice of lemon, and read the newspapers delivered to the porch. The headlines spoke of new stars, scandals, elections, the steady pulse of a world that seemed always to be rushing forward. Her name, of course, was nowhere among them. Afterward, she would walk through the neighborhood, past the stucco houses and silent gardens. Sometimes she would stop to speak with the grocer, who liked her voice and saved the freshest fruit for her. Other times, she walked without aim, the sun sharp on her face, her mind wandering between memory and invention. In those moments, she felt suspended, neither part of the life she had left behind nor fully anchored in this one. In the afternoons, she read. Her shelves were filled not with novels, but with plays, Chekhov, Ibsen, Shakespeare, voices that still spoke to her even when the world did not. She read them aloud sometimes, her voice soft but clear, shaping the air into meaning. She imagined herself once more beneath stage lights, the audience hushed, her every word suspended like breath before release. For a few precious moments she felt whole again, as though the walls of her little room were not confining her, but embracing her, preserving her from the indifference outside. But then the reading would end, and the silence would return, heavy and familiar. She wrote another letter then, one of the longest. It began without greeting and ended without farewell. "I do not know," she wrote, "why I continue to hope for something I cannot name. Perhaps it is habit. Perhaps it is the memory of applause, how it once made me feel less invisible. But applause is only noise, and silence, once you learn to listen to it, is far more honest." She paused, considering the words, and then, without reading them again, folded the page and placed it atop the others. She closed the drawer gently, as one might close the lid of a piano after a final song. As days turned shorter, she found herself sleeping later, dreaming often of voices calling her name from the dark. Sometimes it was her father's voice, gentle and sure, guiding her back toward the stage. Other times it was her own, echoing through empty corridors. The dreams were neither frightening nor comforting. They were simply reminders of what had been lost. She woke each morning to the same pale light filtering through her curtains, the sound of sparrows in the eaves, the slow creak of the house as it settled into the day. One afternoon she took the trolley into town, though she had nowhere in particular to go. The air smelled faintly of rain that would never fall. She wandered through the shops, touching fabrics she could not afford, watching women with painted lips and bright laughter. Their ease fascinated her, though it also felt foreign. She bought a small notebook, blank and bound in soft blue, telling herself she might write something new, perhaps not letters, but fragments of a story. Yet when she returned home and opened its first page, no words came. The emptiness of it seemed to mirror her own. She closed it again and set it aside. In the evenings, she sometimes took her tea outside, sitting on the small wooden steps that faced the canyon. The wind there carried a coolness that the city never knew. She could see, far off, the faint gleam of the sign above the ridge, its letters pale in the dusk. It had become a companion of sorts, distant, silent, unchanging. She often wondered who had built it, what dreams had driven them to raise such a symbol against the sky. Did they imagine, she thought, how many hearts it would one day both inspire and undo? The word itself, Hollywoodland, seemed too large for the fragile hopes of those who lived beneath it. Yet it stood, unwavering, indifferent to the lives it overshadowed. Sometimes, when the air was still, she could hear the faint strains of a piano from one of the nearby houses. The melody was uncertain, like a rehearsal half-remembered. It reminded her of her own beginnings, of those early days in New York when music drifted from the rehearsal halls into the street. The sound made her ache, though she did not wish it away. To ache, after all, was still to feel alive. She began, slowly, to understand her condition not as failure, but as transformation. The stage, the applause, the reviews, all of it had been a kind of youth, bright but unsustainable. Now she lived in the quieter aftermath, the part of life where meaning is not performed but endured. Yet she could not help feeling that she had aged before her time. She was only 24, but the mirror showed her eyes lined with fatigue, her mouth curved into an expression too solemn for youth. Still, when she smiled, the old light returned briefly, like a candle flickering in a draught. On the table beside her bed, she kept a photograph of herself from those earlier years. Bright-eyed, standing in costume, one hand raised mid-gesture. Sometimes she looked at it and tried to reconcile the girl in the picture with the woman she'd become. They seemed like strangers. She touched the edge of the photograph lightly, tracing the outline of her own face. "You did everything you could," she whispered to the image. "You were brave." That night, before sleep, she opened the drawer again. The letters lay there quietly, their envelopes yellowed by time and touch. She ran her fingers over them, as if feeling for a heartbeat beneath the paper. Then she added one more, written that evening, shorter than the others. It contained only a single line. "Someday they will understand that I tried." She folded it, placed it on top, and closed the drawer for the last time. Outside, the wind moved through the canyon, stirring the dry grass. The sound was soft, like a distant whisper of applause carried from another world. She lay awake for a long time, listening to it fade until sleep came. Slow, tender, and filled with the quiet rustle of unwritten words. The wind that brushed the canyon that night seemed to carry an older sound, something gentler and deeper than the rustle of grass. It was almost like the turning of a page, the faintest sigh of memory stirring after long stillness. Peg slept lightly, her dreams rippled by distant echoes. Her father's voice somewhere beyond hearing, the creak of wooden floorboards, the muffled applause of a theater long gone. When morning came, she rose slowly, her hair loose, her thoughts half in that other world. The light through the curtains was pale, filtered, as though it too remembered. She stood by the window, hands resting on the sill, and looked toward the distant city. The hills below shimmered faintly in the new sun, and for a brief, weightless moment, she could almost believe that time had folded, that her father still waited somewhere backstage, calling her name. She had carried his memory across every stage, every city, every ocean. It had become her compass, though she rarely spoke of him aloud. He was the one who had taught her the language of theater, not just its words and gestures, but its secret pulse, its strange merging of truth and illusion. She could still recall his face in the dim light of dressing rooms, powdered and painted, his expression both weary and alive. There had been laughter in those days, the kind that fills the air like warmth, and the smell of varnished wood and smoke. She remembered how he would crouch beside her, still in costume, and let her trace the outlines of the makeup brush across his cheek. "It's only a mask," he would whisper, "but sometimes the mask knows more than the face." She had not understood then, but now the meaning struck her with quiet force. The life she lived in Hollywood was all mask, shining, hollow, necessary. Later that morning, she opened the small box that held what remained of him, a few clippings, an old photograph, the program of one of his last performances. The edges were worn soft by time. She traced his printed name with her fingertip, remembering the thrill she once felt seeing it in bold type. How proud she had been then, the little girl in the front row, certain that her father's voice could command the world, and how quickly it had all been taken. The accident had come with the suddenness of bad news, whispered in a crowded street. One moment of impact, and then silence forever. Peg had never been able to forget that silence. It had shaped her life like an invisible wall, something she kept trying to speak through, to reach beyond. As she looked at the photograph now, she felt not grief, but a deep, slow tenderness. The years had softened the edges of loss, leaving behind a calm ache that almost felt like gratitude. She wondered what he would think if he could see her now. Still standing, still trying, still believing in the old faith that art could make pain beautiful. Would he pity her? Would he be proud? Or would he simply smile that quiet smile of his, the one that said he understood more than words could hold? She pressed the photograph to her chest for a moment before placing it back in the box. Then she sat down, and for the first time in many months, she wept, not in despair, but in release. The afternoon passed softly. She walked along the canyon trails as the shadows lengthened, her steps slow and unhurried. The world seemed hushed, as though holding its breath. Somewhere in the distance, a radio played faintly from an open window, a sentimental song about love and promise. The notes floated toward her, thin and sweet, dissolving in the air. She smiled at the sound, at its innocence. Music always had the power to open old doors within her. Each melody carried her back to the theaters of New York, to the chatter of the dressing rooms, to the rows of faces that once looked up at her with expectation. How young she had been then, how fiercely she had believed that applause was forever. She could still remember the sensation of stepping into the light, of hearing the collective inhale of an audience waiting for her first word. That was the closest she had ever come to feeling immortal. The memory was both balm and wound. She thought again of the playhouses, how their walls seemed to breathe with human emotion, how each curtain held the scent of dust and longing. She could almost hear the soft whisper of the stage manager's voice, the distant creak of ropes. But what stayed with her most was the moment after the final line, when the lights dimmed and the applause began, first uncertain, then rising like a wave. That sound had filled her lungs, her heart, her very being. It was not praise she sought, she realized now, but communion, the brief, holy connection between those who give and those who receive. Nothing in film had ever come close to that. The camera, for all its brilliance, could not love you back. When she returned home, twilight had already begun its descent. The room was bathed in the blue-gray light of evening, and the air felt cool against her skin. She lit the small lamp on her desk, its glow soft and amber. The drawer where her letters rested seemed to call to her, but she did not open it this time. Instead, she took out a blank sheet of paper and began to write. Not a letter, but something closer to a confession. Her handwriting was steady, almost serene. "I think," she wrote, "that we are made of echoes. Everything we love, everything we lose, reverberates through us until we become the echo itself. Perhaps that is what it means to live, to continue sounding even after the music has ended." She paused, her eyes unfocused, and then smiled faintly. The thought comforted her. She folded the page and placed it beside the lamp, unsure whether to keep it or let it go. Outside, the night deepened. The moon rose bright and sharp, casting silver light across the canyon. From her window, she could see the sign on the hill, its letters half illumined, half shadowed. The wind had picked up again, moving through the dry leaves with a low murmur. She opened the window wider and leaned out slightly, breathing in the cool air. The city below shimmered like a vast ocean, each light a small island of longing. Somewhere down there, people were dancing, laughing, making promises they would not keep. The sound reached her only as a faint hum, like the memory of a song. She stayed there for a long time, watching the lights flicker. It seemed to her that every life in that city was a story unfolding at once, some beginning, some ending, all unaware of each other, yet all bound by the same fragile hope. She wondered what her own story looked like from above, whether it glowed faintly or had already faded from view. Perhaps, she thought, it didn't matter. The important thing was that she had lived it fully, even if no one remembered. When she finally turned from the window, the lamp had burned low. The paper beside it trembled slightly in the draft, as though stirred by an unseen hand. She touched it lightly to still it, then lay down, her body curling into the quiet warmth of the sheets. The night outside continued its slow, steady breathing, and somewhere beyond the hills, the first hint of dawn began to gather, unseen but inevitable. In her half-sleep, she thought she heard her father's voice again, soft, reassuring, like the turning of a distant tide, and for the first time in many months, she slept without dreaming. The dawn that followed her dreamless sleep was pale and soundless, the kind of morning that carries neither promise nor threat, only the slow certainty of continuation. The light entered her room gently, touching the folds of her curtains, tracing the curve of her desk where yesterday's words still rested. Peg rose slowly, wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, and stood for a long while before the window. Below her, the city was already waking. A haze hung over the streets like breath, softening the edges of everything it touched. She watched the first cars drift along the boulevard, the distant shimmer of billboards catching the morning sun. Hollywood was stirring again, putting on its painted smile. And yet, in the quiet of that early hour, she could sense something beneath its glitter, a weariness perhaps, or a hunger that had forgotten its name. She walked into the kitchen to make tea, her movements unhurried. The small radio on the counter hummed with static before settling into a soft tune, a singer's voice lilting and fragile. Between the verses, the announcer's voice spoke of premieres, of stars ascending, of a new film that promised to dazzle. Peg listened, though she did not care. The tone was always the same, bright, breathless, oblivious to the quiet wreckage that fame left behind. She thought of the young women she saw each week at auditions, their faces fresh, their laughter nervous. Each one believed she was different, that her light would not fade as others had. Peg smiled sadly into her cup. She had once believed the same. When she stepped outside later that morning, the air was already warming. She walked along the narrow road that led toward the busier streets, the gravel crunching under her shoes. Every surface seemed to shimmer with false perfection. The storefronts, the gleaming cars, the painted faces smiling from posters. But beneath that sheen, she could feel the city fraying. The studios were overworking their stars, the newspapers were hungry for scandal, and the talk on every corner was of who was rising and who had fallen. Success in Hollywood was not a mountain to be climbed, but a carousel, one that never stopped turning even when its riders were too dizzy to stand. That evening, she attended a gathering at a producer's house, a favor called in by a friend who insisted it would be good for her to be seen. The house stood high on a hill, its windows open to the warm night air, the scent of champagne and jasmine mingling with cigarette smoke. Music drifted through the rooms, the the slow swing of a jazz band playing for people who barely listened. Peg entered quietly, greeted the familiar faces with her usual grace, and allowed herself to be drawn into conversation. She had perfected the art of appearing interested without truly engaging, of smiling at the right moments, of laughing softly when expected. It was a performance like any other, and she gave it with weary precision. Around her, the talk was of contracts and scandals, of new faces and sudden disappearances. Someone mentioned an actress who had collapsed on set, another who had vanished after being replaced in a film. Each story was told with fascination, but without empathy, as though tragedy were simply another form of entertainment. Peg listened in silence, her expression composed. These people, she thought, were not cruel. They were simply numbed. In this city, pain had become so common that it no longer startled anyone. She wondered if that numbness would one day claim her too. At some point during the evening, she stepped out onto the terrace. The air outside was cool and smelled faintly of the ocean, though the sea was miles away. The city sprawled below in a glittering web, its lights pulsing faintly like a living thing. Peg leaned against the railing, her glass untouched in her hand, and watched the horizon where the sky and smog met. For all its noise and brightness, Hollywood always seemed to her like a mirage, solid by day, ethereal by night. The laughter from inside the house floated toward her, distant, almost ghostly. She felt herself withdraw further, her heart quieting into stillness. A man joined her, a writer she vaguely knew, kind-eyed but tired-looking. They spoke briefly, politely, the kind of exchange that dissolves as soon as it ends. Yet his parting words lingered. We're all pretending here. Some just do it better than others. When he left, she remained where she was, staring at the dark outline of the hills. His words had struck something deep within her. Pretending. Yes, that was the essence of this place, and perhaps of her life as well. Pretending to be hopeful, pretending to belong, pretending not to feel the slow unraveling of one's own spirit. Later that night, when she returned to her small room, she sat by the window again, still dressed from the party. The moonlight fell across her face, turning her eyes into mirrors. She removed her earrings one by one and placed them on the table. The silence of the room felt heavier than usual, as though the walls themselves were listening. She thought of the people at the party, their laughter echoing through the dark, and she wondered if any of them had paused, even for a moment, to feel the emptiness beneath it all. The thought did not sadden her. It only made her ache with understanding. Everyone here was lonely. Some simply hid it better. The following days passed in a kind of haze. The heat lingered, the hills dry and restless. Peg received an invitation for another audition, a studio test for a supporting role in a romantic picture. She went, though without expectation. The director was distracted, the assistant yawning through her monologue. When she finished, they thanked her mechanically, already calling the next name. As she stepped back into the sunlight, the air shimmered around her like glass. The world seemed strangely distant, as though she were walking through a dream too vivid to touch. That evening, she took a streetcar toward downtown, letting it carry her aimlessly. The streets grew denser, the lights harsher. She watched people hurry along the sidewalks, each absorbed in their own small drama. At a stoplight, a child laughed, chasing a balloon that slipped from his hand and floated upward into the dark. Peg's eyes followed it until it disappeared among the wires and rooftops. There was something in that vanishing that struck her, something about beauty rising, uncontrollable, until it was gone. When she returned home, night had fallen again. The city glowed behind her like an endless stage, and above it all, the sign stood silent. She lit a candle instead of the lamp, watching the small flame sway in the breeze from the window. The room smelled faintly of wax and dust. She sat for a long time without moving, her thoughts drifting like smoke. She remembered a line she had once spoken on stage. "We are all actors in search of an audience." It had been meant as irony, but now it felt like prophecy. Outside, a dog barked in the distance, its sound sharp against the vast stillness. The candle flickered, then steadied. Peg leaned back, her eyes half closed, and listened to the low hum of the city. It sounded to her like an ocean, vast and impersonal, swallowing all who entered its tide. She felt herself sinking into its rhythm, neither resisting nor yielding, simply existing. The glamour of Hollywood, she realized, had never been real. It was not a light that illuminated, but a shimmer that obscured. And behind it lay only the ordinary ache of being human, the longing to be seen, the fear of being forgotten, the quiet acceptance that perhaps both were inevitable. She blew out the candle. The darkness folded around her like velvet, and somewhere, far beyond the hills, a single light blinked out, leaving the night untouched. The candle's smoke lingered for a while after it was gone, curling upward in a thin thread that caught the faint glow from the streetlights below. It drifted toward the open window and was lost to the night air. Peg sat in the dark, her eyes tracing that invisible path until there was nothing left to see. The stillness in the room was deep, but not entirely empty. It was the kind of silence that seemed to breathe with her, to expand and contract, as if the air itself shared her solitude. She felt neither sorrow nor calm, only the soft suspension that comes after too much feeling when the heart must rest from its own weight. The days that followed moved like slow water. Her small room became a kind of sanctuary, though she would not have called it that. The walls were plain, their corners dusted with shadows that changed shape as the sun crossed the sky. In the mornings, the light entered shyly, filtering through thin curtains, painting her table with a pale warmth. In the evenings, the air cooled, carrying the scent of the hills, dry earth, eucalyptus, and faint traces of smoke from distant chimneys. She had learned the rhythm of the canyon by now, the way the birds grew quiet before dusk, the way the wind rose suddenly after dark as if stirred by unseen wings. Sometimes she imagined the hills were alive, breathing with the slow patience of something ancient. Peg kept her routines, not because they brought her joy, but because they kept the hours from dissolving. She rose early, washed carefully, took her tea, and walked into the city. She still went to auditions when she could bear them, though she no longer expected anything from them. She had stopped counting her rejections. They had become as numerous and faint as footsteps in the sand. Some of the casting men recognized her now and greeted her kindly but distantly, as one greets someone whose story is already written. She accepted it without bitterness. It was easier, she thought, to live with quiet disappointment than with false hope. In the afternoons, she often returned to the hills. The path behind her boarding house wound upward through dry grass and small stones. She liked to climb just high enough to see the city spread beneath her like a scattered mirage. From that height, the noise softened to a hum, and the world seemed almost still. Sometimes she brought a book, though she rarely read it. Instead, she watched the light shift across the landscape, the long shadows of the trees, the slow bleeding of gold into rose as the day waned. She found herself thinking less about her future and more about the texture of the present, the sound of wind through brittle leaves, the roughness of stone beneath her palm, the faint pulse of her own breath. At night, she returned to her room and sat by the window with the lamp unlit. She had grown fond of the darkness. It suited her. Through the open glass, she could see the white letters of the sign above, faint but unmistakable against the sky. They seemed closer now, as if they had crept down the hillside in the night to keep her company. She often watched them until sleep came, their silent shapes etched into her mind like a constellation. It comforted her oddly to think of them as sentinels, guardians of all the wandering souls who sought meaning beneath their shadow. Her neighbors sometimes saw her from a distance, walking along the narrow lanes at dusk, her figure small against the vastness of the hills. They greeted her politely, and she would smile, but there was a quiet reserve about her that discouraged further talk. They said she was kind but remote, as if her mind were always elsewhere. Children in the neighborhood whispered that she was an actress, though few knew her name. To most, she was simply the lady from the canyon, who lived alone and spoke softly and was always looking at the hills. There were nights when she left her window open and let the wind enter freely. It filled the room with murmurs, the rustling of leaves, the distant bark of a dog, the faint hum of the city far below. Those sounds became her lullaby. She no longer feared silence. It had become her truest companion. In its presence, she could almost hear her own thoughts more clearly, their edges worn smooth by time. Sometimes she would whisper lines from plays she remembered, not as performance, but as prayer. "What light is this?" she would murmur into the dark, or "all the world's a stage," letting the words fall gently into the air. The sound of her own voice soothed her, reminding her that she still existed. One evening, after a long walk, she stopped halfway up the path and sat on a flat stone overlooking the city. The air was unusually still, and the last light of the day lingered like a faint flame along the horizon. The sign above her stood sharp against the fading sky, its paint peeling, its structure weary. She imagined it sighing in its sleep, tired of bearing the weight of so many dreams. The sight of it filled her with both awe and sadness. It was beautiful, yes, but also broken, like the people who came to live beneath it. She wondered if one day it would fall, letter by letter, and the city would forget it had ever stood. But no, she thought. Things like this never truly vanish. They become symbols, and symbols are far harder to bury than truth. She returned home as the first stars appeared. In her room, the air smelled faintly of rain that had not yet fallen. She opened the drawer that held her letters and ran her fingers over the envelopes. There was comfort in their presence, even unopened. They were her unseen audience, her quiet chorus of understanding. She did not need to read them. She knew their contents by heart, the longing, the gratitude, the exhaustion, the small flickers of hope that refused to die. That night, she wrote one more. "The city sleeps," she began, "but the hills are awake. I think they remember more than we do. They have watched so many of us arrive full of light and leave, carrying our own shadows. Perhaps that is why they remain silent. They have seen it all before." She paused, dipped her pen again, and continued. "If anyone ever finds these words, I hope they understand that I loved the world, even when it forgot to love me." When she finished, she folded the page slowly, carefully, as if it were fragile glass. She did not place it in the drawer this time. Instead, she set it on the table beside her lamp, the paper catching a thin sliver of moonlight. She looked at it for a long moment, then turned toward the window. The night was deep now, the stars faint but steady. The wind moved softly through the canyon, carrying the faint scent of dust and night flowers. She leaned her head against the wall and closed her eyes. In the distance, she could hear a faint hum, the city, eternal and indifferent, whispering its sleepless lullaby. Beneath it, the hills breathed their ancient rhythm. Between the two, she felt herself suspended, neither wholly alive in the world below, nor entirely lost to the silence above. The room held its breath around her. Somewhere in that stillness, she thought she heard the faint echo of applause, not loud, not triumphant, but tender, like the sound of waves touching shore. It faded quickly, but the warmth of it remained, resting softly in her chest. The faint echo of applause lingered within her, even after it faded from the air. It seemed to settle somewhere beneath her ribs, a ghostly rhythm that pulsed quietly whenever the world around her fell silent. She rose the next morning, feeling neither rested nor weary, but caught between those two soft states where time becomes weightless. The hills beyond her window were pale with mist, their edges blurred, the sign above them still veiled in cloud. For a long while she stood watching the fog drift between the letters, wondering what the world might look like if everything familiar were erased. Perhaps it would be merciful, she thought, to begin again in such whiteness. The day passed in its usual rhythm, though the air felt heavier than before. She walked into town, her gloves buttoned, her steps steady, her eyes taking in the details that others ignored. The faces of strangers on the tram, the wilted flowers on a cafe table, the way sunlight fractured across a window pane. Everything seemed fragile, made of glass and dust. When she reached the post office, she carried with her the letter she had written the night before. She waited in line for several minutes, listening to the low murmur of voices, then turned away and slipped the envelope back into her bag. Some words, she decided, were not meant to travel beyond their silence. By afternoon, she was home again. The wind had changed. It came now from the west, dry and restless, stirring the loose pages on her desk. She gathered them, placed them neatly into the drawer, and closed it once more. There was a strange clarity in her movements, a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with hope. She tidied the small room, washed the single cup she had used for tea, folded the shawl draped across the chair. The ordinary gestures of care felt almost sacred, as if preparing a stage before a final act. When she was finished, she sat by the window and watched the sky darken. Evening descended without hurry. The city below began to flicker with lights, the first stars appearing above the hills. Peg's eyes followed the thin path that wound up toward the sign. She had walked it many times before, always turning back before the top, satisfied to let the letters watch over her from afar. Tonight she felt their pull more strongly, not as temptation but as invitation. It was not despair that guided her, nor madness, nor even exhaustion, but a quiet desire for stillness, the kind she had never known in life, where applause always gave way to echo and joy to its shadow. She rose from her chair and opened the drawer one last time. From it, she took only a single sheet of paper and a pen. She wrote quickly, the words small but deliberate. There was no preamble, no attempt at poetry. "I am afraid," she began, and then, "I am sorry." She paused after those two sentences, as though listening for an unseen voice to correct her, but none came. Beneath them she added her initials, P.E., as if signing a note between scenes. The brevity of it felt right, clean, unburdened by explanation. She folded the page once, placed it inside a small envelope, and left it upon the desk. The lamp was still unlit. Only the faint light from the window touched the paper, making it glow like a small, self-contained moon. She changed her shoes, tied her coat loosely, and stepped outside. The night air met her with a cool touch, smelling faintly of sage and iron. The street below her lodging was quiet, the houses dimmed, the world suspended in the hush that comes just before sleep. She began to walk, her steps sure but unhurried, the gravel crunching softly beneath her heels. The path to the sign wound upward through brush and broken stone. As she climbed, the sounds of the city receded, replaced by the low murmur of the wind through dry grass. The higher she went, the clearer the stars became. They hung above her in steady silence, unblinking, indifferent. She stopped once to rest, her hand brushing against the rough bark of a eucalyptus tree. The scent rose sharp and clean, reminding her of nights in the theater when she had stood backstage, waiting for her cue. It struck her then that the world itself was a stage, vast and indifferent, and she had been waiting for her cue ever since the applause first faded. The thought did not sadden her. It simply clarified the stillness she felt inside. She continued upward until the earth beneath her feet gave way to the flattened ground at the top, where the great white letters stood anchored against the sky. The sign loomed immense in the moonlight, its metal edges gleaming faintly. Peg walked to the base of the first letter, the H, tall and angular, and placed her hand against its cold surface. The steel was rough beneath her palm, flecked with paint and dust. She stood there for a long moment, breathing slowly, listening to the faint groan of wind through the structure. The view stretched endlessly below her, the city glowing like an ocean of embers, the streets tracing delicate veins of gold. It looked peaceful from this height, its noise and cruelty softened by distance. She felt an odd tenderness for it all, for the people who would wake tomorrow without knowing her name, for the dreams that would rise to replace hers, for the unending cycle of light and loss that defined the place she had once hoped to call home. The wind tugged at her coat, and she closed her eyes. Somewhere within her, the echo of applause returned, not as memory, but as pulse. It filled her ears until it was indistinguishable from the rhythm of her own heart. The sound swelled, then thinned, until it became only the whisper of air around her. She thought of her father then, of his voice murmuring from the wings, of his hand steady on her shoulder. "It's only a mask," he had said. Perhaps this too was a mask, the life, the struggle, even the fear. Beyond it, she sensed, there was something pure and vast waiting to receive her. She opened her eyes one final time and looked out across the expanse of the city. The lights shimmered gently, as if bowing in unison. She took one step forward, then another, her movements calm, precise, rehearsed. The metal beneath her shoes vibrated faintly, the wind rising in a slow crescendo. For an instant she felt as though she were floating, the world expanding outward, limitless and bright. And then there was only silence, perfect, absolute, unbroken. The hills absorbed the sound, the wind continued its slow passage, and the city below slept on. The white letters stood unmoved, gleaming faintly beneath the indifferent stars. Somewhere far down the slope, the eucalyptus leaves rustled, then stilled, as if settling into a long, patient memory. The night held its breath, and the echo that had lived within her for so long at last dissolved into the greater quiet. The dawn that followed was pale and brittle, as if the sun itself hesitated before touching the hills. The air was still cool, carrying the faint sweetness of eucalyptus and dust, but there was something changed in it, an undercurrent of waiting, an awareness not yet named. The first light slipped over the ridge, caught the edges of the white letters, and made them gleam briefly like the bones of some great sleeping creature. For a moment the sign seemed alive, its metal ribs breathing in silence, holding the secret of what had passed during the night. Down below, Los Angeles stirred with its usual rhythm, unaware that the hills had witnessed the quiet erasure of a dream. The city woke as it always did, with noise, with sunlight, with the unthinking continuation of life. Milk trucks rattled down the streets, shopkeepers lifted shutters, and radios hummed with cheerful voices. No one yet knew that a story had ended while they slept. The sky was bright and empty. Only the hills carried the faintest tremor of what had happened. It was late morning when a hiker, following one of the winding trails that led toward the crest, noticed something glinting near the base of the H. At first he thought it was a bundle of cloth caught against the wire fence. The breeze shifted and the shape revealed itself more clearly. A woman's form, still and small against the vast curve of earth. He stood for a moment without moving, struck by the stillness of it, by the strange dignity that lingered in the scene. When he approached, he saw that she had fallen gracefully, almost as if she had lain herself down to rest. Her hair was loose, her coat buttoned. The dust around her shimmered faintly in the sunlight. Near her hand lay one shoe, and farther away, a small purse. He called out, but his voice sounded wrong in the open air, absorbed immediately by the silence. Then, with careful steps, he turned away and descended the hill to fetch help. By noon, the police had arrived. Their voices broke the morning calm, orders, questions, the click of cameras. Reporters came soon after, their cars leaving tracks in the soft earth. The sign that had once stood as a symbol of glamour now bore silent witness to the weight of human frailty. They cordoned off the area, whispered, took notes. Someone found the letter she had left behind, folded neatly on her desk, and read its brief message aloud. The words, so few, so simple, seemed to hang in the air longer than they should have. I am afraid. I am sorry. There was no explanation, no name for the sorrow that had led her there. Only those two small confessions, unadorned and final. The newspapers wrote of it by afternoon. They called her the actress, the girl from the sign, the fallen star. Her real name, when it appeared, seemed secondary to the story that now began to build around her. The world was quick to understand her as a symbol, slower to remember her as a person. They printed her photograph beside the towering letters, her face serene, almost luminous. The irony was irresistible to them. The actress who had leapt from the very emblem of Hollywood's promise. Headlines spoke of tragedy, of lost hope, of the price of dreams, and somewhere within those words, her humanity dissolved, replaced by legend. Yet in the quiet corners of the city, not everyone read her as an abstraction. At the small boarding house in Beechwood Canyon, her neighbors stood together on the porch, whispering softly. They spoke of her kindness, her quiet grace, the way she greeted them each morning. One of them remembered hearing her humming through the thin walls just days before, a tune they could not quite place. Another recalled how she had fed a stray cat that lingered near the steps. To them, she was not a symbol or a headline. She was the woman who lived among them, polite, private, and unfailingly gentle. When they read her name in print, it seemed like a mistake, as if the world had stolen her from them and replaced her with a myth. The theater world in New York heard the news days later. A few old colleagues remembered her vividly, the young actress with the clear voice, the precise movement, the eyes that seemed to see beyond the stage lights. Some spoke of her talent, others of her sadness. One man, who had once shared the stage with her, wrote a brief note to the newspaper. She was better than the roles she was given. That single sentence might have been her epitaph, though it would never be carved in stone. Meanwhile, the city went on. The studios kept turning, the lights kept glowing, and the sign remained. For all its sudden fame, it stood unchanged, unmoved by the tragedy it had framed. At night, its pale surface caught the moonlight, and from the city below, it looked almost untouched, as though it bore no memory of what had happened. But the hills remembered. The dry grass along the path where she had walked whispered when the wind passed through. The eucalyptus leaves shivered with faint echoes of her footsteps. Even the dust seemed to hold the impression of her last stillness. A week after her death, a story circulated, perhaps true, perhaps imagined, that a letter arrived at her former address offering her a new role. A studio, having finally reviewed her screen test, wished to cast her in a production that would begin in the coming weeks. The irony was too sharp to be believed, yet people repeated it anyway. It comforted them to think that her despair had come just a little too soon, that if she had waited one more day, the world might have turned in her favor. But Peg had never lived by such timing. Her tragedy was not of misfortune, but of exhaustion, a soul worn thin by striving, unable to find rest in a world that measured worth by applause. In the evenings that followed, curious visitors began to climb the hill, drawn by the story. They came quietly, as if entering a chapel. Some brought flowers, laying them at the base of the H. Others stood in silence, staring at the city below. They said the air up there felt different, heavier somehow, as though it carried both beauty and sorrow in equal measure. One woman claimed she saw a figure in white drifting near the sign at dusk, her hair lifted by the wind. The story spread quickly, and before long, Peg Entwistle had become not merely a tragedy, but a legend. The ghost of Hollywoodland, forever walking the border between dream and despair. But on that first morning, before the stories began, there was only the stillness, the pure, unbroken quiet of the hills beneath the rising sun. The men who carried her down moved gently, their footsteps muffled by the dust. A few wildflowers had begun to open near the trail, their petals trembling in the breeze. Far above them, the sign loomed in its blank majesty, its letters catching the light once more. It would shine like that again that evening, and the evening after, and for many years to come. By nightfall, the city had already forgotten its own sorrow. The theaters reopened, the streets filled with laughter, and the world continued its restless spinning. Yet somewhere in the hills between the eucalyptus and the silence, something of her remained, not a ghost, but a vibration, a trace of grace that the wind could not quite erase. The sound of it lingered faintly in the branches, an unheard cry that was not grief, but release. The city slept beneath it, unaware that a single human life had become, in its ending, part of the landscape's endless song. The hills grew quiet again after the commotion faded, the trails returning to their usual rhythm of dust and wind. Yet something invisible had changed. The silence that had once lain gently across the canyon now carried a murmur, as if the earth itself were learning to whisper her name. It began softly, passed from one mouth to another, carried in low voices through the city's restless corridors. People spoke of the actress who had leapt from the sign, their tones half curious, half reverent, as though recounting the details of an old prophecy. In the cafes of Hollywood Boulevard, men lowered their voices when they mentioned her, and women shook their heads with sorrow that was only partly sincere. The story spread faster than any role she had ever played, and soon the city that had overlooked her in life could not stop speaking of her in death. Her name appeared in the columns of newspapers that once ignored her, printed now in bold letters beside words like tragedy and mystery. Writers reached for phrases to contain what they could not understand. A fallen star, the girl who died for fame, the ghost of Hollywoodland. They did not know her, yet they described her with the confidence of those who claim to know all that glitters. Each article polished her memory into something smooth and marketable, stripped of the quiet complexity that had once defined her. Even those who had met her briefly began to tell embellished stories, how she had spoken of destiny, how her eyes seemed haunted, how she had always been too delicate for this world. The truth, as always, was smaller and deeper. She had simply been tired, and no one had noticed. Within a month, her image began to reappear. Old photographs surfaced, some from her days on stage, others from publicity stills long forgotten. Her face, pale and luminous, stared from magazine pages and shop windows. People paused to look at her, drawn not by recognition but by the suggestion of beauty linked forever to loss. There was power in that combination, and Hollywood knew how to use it. A studio publicist, sensing opportunity, declared her the symbol of all who dared to dream too high. A small theater downtown revived one of the plays she had once appeared in, dedicating the performance to her memory. For a brief moment, Peg Entwistle became what she had always wished to be, an unforgettable name, though she was no longer here to hear it. At night, when the city quieted and the streetlights hummed, the sign stood like a sentinel, gleaming faintly against the dark sky. Those who lived nearby said the wind had changed since her death. It carried a new note, a strange harmony that rose from the canyons after midnight. Some swore they heard footsteps along the ridge, the crunch of gravel, the soft brush of fabric. Others spoke of a figure seen from afar, standing near the H, her outline framed against the stars. The tales grew in the telling, woven into the city's endless appetite for myth. Peg had entered that rare realm of those who become more alive in their absence. But beneath the gossip and invention, a quieter remembrance endured. There were those who had truly known her, fellow actors, neighbors, friends from New York, and for them, the story was not one of glamour or horror, but of a woman who had walked bravely through too much solitude. They remembered her laughter, dry and warm, her careful manners, the way she would listen without interrupting. They remembered that she had once believed deeply in art's power to make suffering bearable. When they read the sensational accounts of her death, they felt a dull anger that such dignity could be reduced to spectacle. Yet they too were helpless against the machinery of the city, which turned everything it touched into narrative. The studio where she had once tested her voice moved on quickly. New actresses arrived, their faces bright with expectation, their laughter echoing down the corridors. None of them spoke of Peg, though they knew the story. It lingered in the air like a superstition no one wished to name. When the sun set and the sound stages emptied, some of the crew would glance toward the hills, uneasy without knowing why. The white letters gleamed faintly in the distance, as if reflecting some invisible presence. Months passed, and still her name appeared from time to time in conversation, less as a memory than as a warning. Parents of aspiring actresses spoke of her when cautioning their daughters. Journalists mentioned her when describing the costs of ambition. Each retelling shifted her shape a little more. The woman who had once stood upon the stage, whose voice had carried tenderness and fire, became a figure of caution, a morality tale cloaked in tragedy. Yet there were others, mostly dreamers and wanderers, who saw something else in her story. To them, she was not a warning, but a mirror, a reminder of how fragile and luminous hope can be, how easily the line between desire and despair can blur. As the years passed, the legend began to soften. The sharp edges of scandal dulled into melancholy, and Peg's story became part of the city's background music, a faint refrain beneath its louder songs. Tour guides mentioned her name as their buses wound through the canyon, their voices casual, almost affectionate. They pointed to the sign and said, "That's where she jumped," as though it were a landmark of beauty rather than grief. The passengers would crane their necks, murmur in awe, and then move on, already thinking of something else. Yet for those few seconds, her story lived again, reshaped by strangers who never knew her face. Sometimes, on quiet nights when fog rolled in from the ocean, the hills vanished completely, and only the upper edges of the sign showed above the mist. From certain angles, it looked as if it were floating, detached from the earth. A word adrift in cloud. The city lights below flickered faintly through the veil, and the whole scene seemed suspended between dream and waking. Those who saw it often felt a chill, as though they had glimpsed something sacred. It was in moments like these that Peg's presence felt most near, not as a ghost, but as a question that could never quite be answered. What had she thought in those last moments? Did she believe she was leaving behind a message, or simply escaping the weight of endless waiting? Did she know that her name would echo through decades, that strangers would speak it in awe and pity? The city would never know. It could only fill the silence with its own voice, weaving her absence into the endless tapestry of its myths. And so the whisper continued, carried through the years like wind across the canyon. Her name, once lost among casting lists and forgotten playbills, had found a strange immortality. It slipped from lips that never knew its owner. It shimmered in the glow of the sign that had witnessed her fall. The hills listened, the wind moved, and somewhere between them, her story lived on. Not as tragedy alone, but as the echo of a woman who had once dared to believe in beauty, and whose longing had outlasted her own breath. The whisper of her name never entirely faded. It moved through the years like smoke, shapeless yet persistent, clinging to the white letters that had watched her final ascent. The sign, once merely an advertisement for real estate, had changed forever after that night. It had absorbed her story, as if the metal and wood themselves had taken her into their memory. The word Hollywoodland, meant to lure buyers to a dream of property and sunshine, had become something else entirely, a shrine built unwittingly to ambition and loss. Time passed, and still the sign endured, weathering wind, rain, and the slow decay of its own purpose. The hills shifted around it. The city beneath it multiplied, but it remained, a monument both to all that had been promised and all that had been broken. In the decades that followed, the sign began to crumble. Its paint peeled, its supports rusted, its lights went dark one by one. There were winters when the fog rolled in thick as memory, wrapping it in ghostly whiteness, and summers when the sun bleached it to bone. People began to call it cursed. They said the actress's spirit lingered there, her footsteps echoing in the dry earth at night, her form glimpsed between the towering letters. Some claimed that dogs refused to walk near it, that the air around it grew cold even in July. Whether or not these things were true mattered less than the fact that people wanted to believe them. The story gave the sign a soul, and the city, built as it was upon illusion, could not resist a soul that shimmered between truth and imagination. Visitors climbed the hill as though making a pilgrimage. Lovers carved their initials into the wooden posts. Poets sat in the shade of its shadow, scribbling verses about the price of beauty. From the canyons below, one could hear their murmurs carried on the wind. Her name, her story, her imagined last words. They brought flowers sometimes, leaving them near the base of the H, though few knew exactly where she had fallen. The flowers withered quickly in the heat, their petals turning brittle and pale, and the wind scattered them into the brush. But the act itself became ritual, a small offering to a memory that refused to vanish. By the time the sign was repaired in the 1940s, much of its original structure had already succumbed to rot. The city debated tearing it down altogether. To some, it was an eyesore, a relic of another era. To others, it was sacred ground. In the end, sentiment won. Workmen came with new timber and paint, their hammers echoing through the hills like distant drums. As they worked, a few of them swore they heard voices on the wind, soft, indistinct, as though someone were rehearsing lines in a language the living no longer spoke. The foreman laughed it off, yet he kept glancing toward the ridge until the work was done. When the last letter was secured and the sun fell behind the mountains, the sign stood gleaming once more, its edges sharp, its meaning reborn. But its rebirth was different. The word land remained for a time, then was removed, leaving only Hollywood. It was shorter now, simpler, grander, a name that contained both dream and warning. The absence of those final letters made the sign seem incomplete, and yet somehow truer. It no longer promised a place to live, it promised an idea to chase, and behind that promise, like a shadow at sunset, lingered Peg's story, the reminder that every light has its cost. Through the decades, the legend evolved. Each generation remade her in its own image. In one retelling, she was a tragic ingenue betrayed by love. In another, a martyr to the cruelty of fame. Some said she had been destined to die that way, that her leap was not despair, but defiance, a gesture that claimed the very symbol meant to consume her. The truth, fragile and ordinary, was lost beneath the layers of invention. Yet perhaps the inventions were kinder than reality. They gave her meaning beyond the smallness of circumstance, turning her into a figure who could stand for everyone who had ever reached towards something too bright to hold. As film became the city's heartbeat, her image reappeared in subtler forms. Directors borrowed fragments of her story, the lonely actress, the fatal climb, the silent city below. Her ghost walked through reels of celluloid, unnamed yet recognizable, her silhouette flickering behind the dreams of others. Even as the world moved on, her presence remained, threaded into the fabric of the myth that Hollywood spun endlessly for itself. The sign, once a backdrop, became a character, the eternal witness, the patient monument to both beginnings and endings. There were nights when fog gathered thick around the hills, swallowing the letters until only their tops showed through, a row of pale crowns floating in air. From the city below, it looked like a vision half-formed, as if the sky itself were trying to remember what it had once promised. The wind that wound through the canyons carried the scent of sage, and sometimes, faintly, the echo of laughter. It was said that if one stood very still and listened, one could hear the soft rustle of fabric, the light tread of footsteps upon the path. Those who heard it rarely spoke of it aloud, afraid that words might break the spell. The legend thrived not in the telling, but in the listening. And still, the city grew. The old theaters closed or turned to dust, replaced by glass towers and billboards that shone even brighter than before. Yet from every rooftop, from every boulevard, the sign remained visible, its letters clean again, its shape unchanged. It watched over the lives that came and went, the faces that rose and faded. Beneath it, the canyon filled with new houses, new stories, new hearts that beat with the same restless hunger that had drawn Peg there so long ago. Sometimes, during those rare quiet hours before dawn, when the wind paused and the city seemed to sleep, the sign glowed softly in the half-light. The birds had not yet begun to stir, and the streets below were washed pale with moonlight. In that stillness, one could almost believe that she was there again, not in sorrow but in calm. Watching, perhaps, or simply resting. Her story no longer belonged to any single moment. It had become part of the landscape itself, woven into the breath of the hills and the shimmer of the sky. And as time moved forward, as generations forgot the details but remembered the feeling, Peg Entwistle's presence became indistinguishable from the signs. The two had fused into one, a name and a symbol joined by tragedy, preserved by myth, immortalized by repetition. People would point to those white letters and think of dreams and despair, of beauty and ruin, never knowing where the story ended and where it began again. For in Hollywood, everything begins again eventually. Even sorrow, even silence, even the echo of a single step on a dark hillside. There are mornings in Los Angeles when the air seems to shimmer before the day has even begun, when the faint haze over the hills catches the first threads of sunlight and turns them into something almost sacred. On such mornings, the sign glows softly, neither golden nor white, but a color that seems to belong to the imagination alone. From the boulevards below, it looks eternal, untouched by the decades that have passed since Peg last stood beneath it. The city has grown vast in her absence, its streets pulsing with the breath of millions, its towers gleaming like instruments of promise. And yet, at its edges, the same quiet hills remain. Every dawn, the light moves across them, just as it did on the day she was found, tender and unknowing. And with that light comes the new generation, the endless procession of dreamers drawn westward by the same fragile hope that once lived in her. They arrive with the same nervous excitement, stepping off trains and airplanes, their suitcases filled with scripts and half-formed faith. Some carry letters of recommendation, some carry nothing but conviction. They rent small rooms in neighborhoods where the streets still echo faintly with the names of those who came before. They learn to walk in the same rhythms, to wait by telephones that rarely ring, to smile through rejection, to endure the bright cruelty of endless sunshine. And though few know her story in detail, they live within its echo. Each time they look up and see those white letters stretched across the ridge, something within them tightens, a mingling of awe and unease, a wordless awareness that the dream they pursue is built upon both radiance and ruin. At night, when the city's noise fades into the hum of distant cars, some of them climb the trail toward the sign. They say they go to think, to breathe, to see the city from above. But what they are really seeking is a kind of communion, a silent conversation with the symbol that has watched over all their ambitions. From up there, the world looks both infinite and small, and for a moment they feel seen by something vast. They stand where Peg once stood, though they do not know it, and they too are filled with the same contradiction: wonder and fear, hope and doubt. The wind moves around them as it did around her, carrying the same scent of dust and sage, and if they listen closely, they might almost hear her whisper among the rustling leaves, not a warning, but a presence, gentle and enduring. The years have not erased her. They have only changed her form. She lives now in the dreams of strangers, in the glint of light on the sign at dusk, in the quiet despair that sometimes visits the hearts of those who chase beauty too long. The city has learned to speak her language without knowing it. Each studio light, each shutter's click, each breathless audition is a repetition of her prayer to be seen, to matter, to outlast the silence. Hollywood, in all its feverish brightness, remains her mirror. It promises everything and keeps almost nothing, yet the faithful continue to come. They come because the promise itself is a kind of heaven, even when it burns. There are nights when the wind over the canyon carries a strange, melodic hum, a note that rises and falls like distant applause. The locals say it is only the metal scaffolding of the sign shifting in the cold, but those who linger long enough feel otherwise. It sounds too alive, too deliberate, as if the hills themselves are remembering something. A voice, a heartbeat, the faint rhythm of footsteps climbing toward the unknown. Those who hear it fall silent. They look down at the city, and for a brief instant they understand the truth of the place, that every dream, no matter how bright, casts a shadow, and that to chase the light is to accept the darkness that follows. Time has tried to soften the legend, but it refuses to fade. The sign, repaired and repainted countless times, gleams now under spotlights, immortalized in postcards and films, a shorthand for everything the city represents. Tourists gaze at it from observation decks and whisper about the actress who jumped, though most do not know her name. They see only the silhouette, the outline of the myth, and yet, in their unknowing, they keep her alive. Every whispered retelling, however incomplete, becomes another thread in the tapestry of her afterlife. She has become part of the architecture of belief, woven into the city's identity like the pulse beneath its neon veins. Occasionally, a filmmaker or a writer will rediscover her story. They will visit the archives, read the old newspaper clippings, trace the grainy photograph of her face. They will speak of giving her back her voice, of rescuing her from obscurity. They will craft versions of her, each one different, each one sincere, and in doing so, they will add to the long chain of interpretations that stretch back to the morning after her death. Peg Entwistle will become once again what she always was, a character shaped by others' longing. But perhaps that is fitting. Perhaps in the end, her truest performance was the one that never ended, the one that continues through the retelling of her life. Still, the hills remain the only ones who know the real story. They alone remember the texture of her footsteps, the soft imprint of her hand upon the metal, the hush that followed when the wind ceased for a breathless instant. The earth does not romanticize, it remembers. Every time the sun slips behind the mountains and the sign glows pale against the twilight, the hills whisper what the city has forgotten, that she was human, fragile, and brave, that she sought not fame but meaning, and that in her brief, fierce way, she found it. There is a quiet irony in her legacy. She died in search of recognition, and yet it is her anonymity that has made her eternal. Her name drifts through time without boundaries, touching those who never knew her, speaking softly to anyone who has ever reached beyond their grasp. The dreamers who come after her carry her without realizing it. They walk through the same sunlight, breathe the same dry air, and feel the same ache for something greater than themselves. And perhaps that is her true immortality, not the stories, not the legend, but the echo of her courage that still trembles in the air whenever someone stands before the sign and dares to believe. When night finally deepens and the lights of the city spread outward like molten gold, the sign watches over them all. It glows steadily, patient as the moon, its letters no longer a promise but a memory. The wind continues to move through the canyons, lifting small fragments of sound, the laughter of newcomers, the sigh of those leaving, the rustle of old dreams settling into the earth. In that mingling of voices, her presence endures, quiet but infinite, like the breath of the hills themselves. And if one listens closely, in the silence just before dawn, they might hear it again. the faint, familiar murmur of a woman's voice, still alive somewhere in the wind, saying only what she always meant to say, that she loved the dream, even when it no longer loved her. The wind that carried her voice across the hills did not always sound mournful. At times it moved softly through the eucalyptus leaves with a rhythm that was almost like music, a faint echo of orchestras tuning in faraway theaters, of curtains lifting to reveal faces caught between fear and wonder. Perhaps it was only imagination, yet those who lingered long enough beneath the sign sometimes spoke of hearing the low hum of an audience unseen, a sigh of expectation in the darkness. It was as if the earth itself remembered the stage she had once loved, the creak of wooden boards underfoot, the fragile hush before the first line was spoken, the warmth of light rising like dawn across a waiting face. For Peg Entwistle had belonged first to that world, and though her name would be forever tied to Hollywood's sign, the truest part of her remained in the quiet glow of the theater, where shadows and breath became art. In the years after her passing, the theater community in New York kept her memory differently from Hollywood's tabloids. They did not speak of her as myth, but as colleague, as presence. Those who had worked beside her remembered a certain stillness she carried on stage, a gift that needed no embellishment. They said she could stand in silence and draw every eye, not by beauty alone, but by an inward gravity, a calm that made the air itself attentive. The critics of her time had called it restraint. Her peers called it truth. To them, she was not a woman chasing fame, but one trying, with all the sincerity of youth, to give shape to the invisible. They kept her name quietly alive in dressing rooms and backstage corridors, where dust floated through beams of golden light, and someone always seemed to be waiting in the wings for a cue that would never come. When the new actresses of the next decade read her old reviews, they were moved by the tenderness in the language, by the hints of something fragile and unfinished. Some began to ask about her, to search for photographs, to whisper her story between rehearsals. A few older directors spoke of her as one of those souls who had been too delicate for the brutal machinery of film, who belonged instead to the living pulse of the stage. In time, her story became a kind of legend there as well, not the cautionary tale it had become in Hollywood, but a parable of devotion, of how art could both save and destroy those who loved it too purely. And so, in theaters where the lights burned low and the smell of paint and powder mingled in the air, her ghost was said to linger, not haunting, but watching, as if unwilling to leave the world that had once given her purpose. One night, many years later, an actress rehearsing a scene alone in an empty playhouse swore she felt a presence behind her. She turned and saw no one, only the curtain trembling faintly though the air was still. Yet she was certain she had not been alone. When she spoke her lines again, her voice came out steadier, truer, as if guided by an unseen hand. The next day, she told the stage manager, who only smiled and said, "Perhaps Peg was with you." No one laughed. In that quiet circle of artists, it was understood that memory could take such shapes, that those who loved the stage deeply never truly left it. The walls of theaters hold sound differently. They remember, they echo. If one could listen closely enough in those old New York houses, one might still hear her voice, low, precise, tinged with that faint English lilt that made every word seem weighted with meaning. Perhaps it is caught in the grain of the floorboards, in the dust that rises when the curtains sway. The theater has always been a place of ghosts, and Peg's, if it exists, would not be one of fright, but of patience. She would stand in the wings, watching with that same expression she had worn in life, calm, attentive, unyielding in her faith that something beautiful could emerge from impermanence. Her colleagues aged, retired, were forgotten in their turn, but the spirit of their craft endured. Generations of performers inherited her belief without knowing her name. Every time an actor stepped into the light and felt the trembling joy of being seen, they repeated her gesture. Every time an audience fell silent in recognition of something true, they kept her alive. The theater is not an archive of faces. It is a breathing memory, one that renews itself each night with the courage of those who dare to speak into the dark. Peg Entwistle had spoken into that darkness once, and the darkness, instead of swallowing her, had carried her voice forward like a secret. It is tempting to imagine that she found peace in that continuity, that somewhere, beyond the boundaries of time, she remains among the flickering lights and half-whispered lines, no longer striving, simply listening. The idea is gentle, almost redemptive, that the same silence that once frightened her has become her home. And perhaps it is not entirely fanciful, for there are nights when actors finishing their final bows step onto empty stages and feel a stillness settle around them, not heavy but kind, as though unseen hands were applauding softly. They cannot name it, but they smile. The lights dim, the dust drifts, and for a moment the distance between past and present vanishes. In this way, Peg's story found its quiet ending, not in the violent act that bound her to legend, but in the endurance of her art. The world remembered her tragedy, but the stage remembered her truth. The sign on the hill may have claimed her body, but the theater kept her soul. And in that, perhaps, there lies a kind of grace, that the place which first gave her life still holds her gently, whispering her name not as a warning, but as a benediction. Outside, the city would go on growing, its lights multiplying, its ambitions renewing. Yet somewhere in the folds of that endless motion, in every rehearsal room and every quiet breath before a performance, her presence lingers, a reminder that art, like grief, is only another form of love. The curtains fall, the lights go out, and still the echo remains, soft and steady, like a heartbeat beneath the boards. It says nothing more than this, that she was here, that she spoke, that she was heard. There are places in the world where light seems to remember more than the living do. Hollywood is one of them. The sunlight there has always had a peculiar quality, bright yet brittle, merciless in its beauty. It pours over every surface with the same indifference, revealing as much as it conceals. Beneath that light, Peg Entwistle's story endured like a faint outline on glass, visible only when the angle was right. The years rolled forward, gilded and relentless, and the city forgot almost everything except its own reflection. Yet even amid its blinding glare, the shadow of her name remained, quiet and persistent, a reminder that brightness and darkness are not enemies, but twins born of the same desire to be seen. The paradox of fame had never been more evident than in her memory. She had sought it with sincerity, not vanity, a longing to share, to make herself understood. But fame, once achieved by others, appeared to her as something strange and unstable, a light too hot to stand beneath for long. It revealed and erased in equal measure. Those who shone brightest became images, and images, though they endure, are only fragments of truth. The city understood this even as it denied it. It built temples to the visible, cinemas, billboards, stars pressed into pavement, while quietly burying the invisible lives that sustained them. And in the balance between the two, Peg became an emblem, the figure who had vanished into the very thing she pursued. Her story lived most vividly in that tension between illumination and disappearance. In photographs, she appeared as a creature of light, eyes uplifted, smile faint, her face composed of soft contrasts. But behind those eyes was the darker landscape of effort, fear, exhaustion. It was that unseen part that lent her image its strange power. Viewers felt something within it that refused to rest, a quiet vibration of truth beneath the surface glamour. That was what had set her apart in life, and what kept her luminous in death. She had not known how to be false. Even when performing, she remained unguarded, and the world, unaccustomed to such nakedness, turned away. In this way, Peg's story came to mirror the story of Hollywood itself. The city was built on the promise of eternal light, each new star a small sun, each premiere a sunrise. But every light casts its shadow, and every star burns out in time. Beneath the glitter lay the quiet accumulation of forgotten names, of faces once adored and later ignored. They lingered like dust on the reels of film, their gestures repeating endlessly for an audience that no longer existed. If one were to walk the streets of Los Angeles at night, one could almost feel them in the glow of the marquees, a host of the unseen, watching, patient, waiting to be remembered. Peg, in her strange way, became their voice. Writers who revisited her life decades later often described her as a warning, a figure who had mistaken illusion for purpose. But that was only part of the truth, for even in her despair, she had sensed the limits of illusion. The letter she left behind was brief, not because she had nothing to say, but because she understood that words could not undo what silence had already decided. She had reached a point beyond expression, where the light and the dark finally met and ceased to contradict one another. In her leap, she had bridged them, transforming her small mortal sorrow into something larger, an image that outlived its cause. To those who came after her, her story seemed at once terrible and consoling. It was proof that the city's radiance could destroy, but also that it could preserve. Her tragedy did not vanish. It became part of the legend that fed the dream. Each generation looked at the sign and felt both awe and unease, recognizing, perhaps unconsciously, that beauty and ruin share the same horizon. The dreamers who arrived with their scripts and songs were not deterred by her example. If anything, they were drawn closer to it. They understood instinctively what Peg had lived and died to prove, that the pursuit of light, even when it ends in darkness, is what makes the human story worth telling. There is a moment each evening, just before the city's lights fully bloom, when the sign glows with a color that is neither day nor night. The hills turn copper, the air holds its breath, and for an instant all distinctions blur. It is in that in-between hour that Peg's spirit feels most near, as though she walks once more along the ridge, suspended between shadow and illumination. The wind moves gently through the dry grass, carrying the scent of dust and time, and the city below flickers like a mirror reflecting all the faces that ever turn toward it in longing. To look up at that glow is to glimpse the delicate truth she embodied. That light without shadow blinds, and shadow without light fades to nothing. Her legacy, if one can call it that, lies not in the fame she never had, but in the questions she left behind. What does it mean to be seen? What is the cost of beauty when it becomes currency? Where does the artist end and the image begin? These questions hover still over the canyons and sound stages, whispered by those who feel themselves slipping between their own light and darkness. They find comfort in her name, though they rarely speak it aloud. In her failure, they recognize their own fragility. In her surrender, their own unspoken longing for peace. And so Peg Entwistle remains a figure caught eternally in the liminal space she once occupied in life. Neither fully real nor entirely unreal, neither saint nor caution, but something subtler, the embodiment of the human impulse to reach beyond endurance. The world has grown noisier since her fall, the light brighter, the shadows deeper. Yet somewhere beneath it all, her voice persists, low and steady, repeating the same truth that every artist learns in time, that to create is to disappear a little, to give oneself to something that will not give back, and to trust that even in vanishing, one might leave behind a trace of light. When the final glow of sunset drains from the sky, the sign stands alone in the dark, its white letters ghostly against the blackness. The city hums below, full of movement, full of forgetting. But high above, where the wind moves slow and constant, the line between light and shadow remains blurred, as if the world itself cannot decide which it loves more. And in that space, Somewhere between the last glimmer of day and the first breath of night, she endures, silent, invisible, eternal. Twilight lingered longer than usual that evening, as if reluctant to yield to the dark. The sky above the hills was painted in deep tones of violet and gold, the kind of light that seems to suspend time rather than end it. The city below, restless as ever, began to glow from within, each street and window flickering like a single cell in a vast, breathing organism. And there, high above it all, the white letters stood unchanged, unmoved, and yet never entirely still. They caught the last fire of the sun and then released it, fading gradually into the soft gray of night. It was in this slow vanishing that Peg's story found its quiet completion, not in tragedy or fame, but in endurance. She had become part of the rhythm of this place, her name absorbed into its endless cycle of light and shadow, her breath dissolved into the same air that carried the laughter and longing of those who came after her. As darkness gathered, the hills grew still, but not silent. The wind moved through the dry grass in long, low waves, whispering against the stones, and the scent of eucalyptus rose from the canyons below. It was the same sound she had heard so many times before, walking home beneath the sign, wondering what awaited her in the next day's light. That sound, that faint, eternal murmur, seemed to speak now in her place. It carried no sorrow, no regret, only the simple persistence of the earth itself, which endures every story told upon it. The stars emerged one by one, distant yet unwavering, like small witnesses in a trial long concluded. They shone upon the sign, upon the city, upon all who had ever sought the light and found themselves blinded by it. Their brilliance was ancient, impartial, endlessly patient. The world below continued as it always had. Cars wound along the boulevards, the hum of radios filled the night, and somewhere a theater curtain rose once more. Inside that theater, perhaps, a young actress took her first steps into the light, her voice trembling slightly as she spoke her opening line. In that moment, the audience leaned forward, drawn by the fragile courage of a soul revealing itself. She would not know it, but Peg's presence was with her, in the hush before the applause, in the pulse of risk that beats beneath every performance. That, more than anything, was how she remained, not in mourning, but in motion, carried forward through the living gestures of others. Every act of creation, every leap into uncertainty was her legacy reborn. For those who remembered her, the meaning of her story changed with time. To some, she remained the warning whispered to newcomers, "Beware of dreams too bright." To others, she became a symbol of purity, of the artist's eternal struggle against indifference. But to the hills that held her final breath, she was neither warning nor saint. She was simply part of the landscape now, a note folded into the city's great and unfinished song. The wind that brushed the sign each night did not distinguish between despair and hope. It carried both in equal measure, as life always does. And perhaps that was her final gift, to remind the world that sorrow, too, can be luminous if one dares to look at it long enough. Years turned into decades, and decades into memory. The sign was restored again, its letters reinforced, its surface gleaming under new lights. The world changed. Films became digital, stars rose and fell with the speed of seconds, and yet her story endured, untethered to fashion or fame. People still spoke her name in passing, sometimes in reverence, sometimes in curiosity. Others who had never heard of her felt her presence anyway, though they could not have said why. She had become one of those quiet forces that move unseen through the world, shaping it not by what they do, but by what they leave behind. And what she left behind was not despair, but understanding, that the human heart, fragile though it is, cannot live without the promise of light, that even in failure there is a strange kind of beauty, the beauty of having tried, of having believed, of having stepped fully into the dream. The sign above Hollywood still spelled that promise, and perhaps always would. It called to those who arrived hungry for meaning, who longed to be seen, who dared to stand beneath its shadow and whisper to themselves, "Perhaps this time it will be different." And when they looked up, they looked upon her legacy, not her death, but her defiance, her leap into the impossible, her refusal to live without faith in the invisible. Sometimes, in the hour before dawn, when the sky begins to pale and the city has not yet stirred, the sign seems to glow of its own accord. The lights below have dimmed, the stars are fading, and for a fleeting moment the world is still. It is then, they say, that her spirit walks the ridge, quiet and unhurried. She pauses beside the H, as she did that last night, and gazes down at the city she once loved and feared. She does not haunt it, she blesses it. Her presence is no longer a cry for recognition, but a benediction for all who continue to dream, even knowing the cost. When the first light touches the letters, she fades again, becoming sky, becoming air, becoming the sound of the wind that moves through the canyon, steady, endless, free. And so the curtain falls, not with applause, but with silence, the kind of silence that is not emptiness, but completion. The hills exhale, the city inhales, and between them, Peg Entwistle endures, not as ghost or tragedy, but as part of the eternal balance that binds the living to their longing. Her story remains where it began, among the lights and the shadows, between the earth and the air, beneath a sign that still shines for those who seek to touch the unreachable. Her life, brief as it was, became a mirror in which countless souls have seen their own reflection, the hunger, the faith, the beauty, the fall. And perhaps that is what immortality truly means, not to be remembered by name, but to live on in the quiet courage of others. The wind moves through the canyon again, gentle and familiar, whispering across the letters that gleam pale in the growing light. The day begins, the city awakens, and the dream, eternal and merciless, begins anew.